Good morning. Welcome, and I'd like to open the Thursday, March 22nd Delta Stewardship Council meeting with roll call.
Emerald here. Weinberg here.
Vierini here.
Thompson here.
We have a quorum. File item number 3 is to recess into closed executive session. For those of you that are following on the webcast, our estimate is this will last approximately an hour, but I would recommend you tune in sometime after 9:30 just in case we breeze through the closed session. So we are now recessed to closed executive session. I think we're ready to go. Thank you, Bob. Welcome to those of you who have joined us. Since we opened the meeting earlier this morning, we are now reconvening in open session. Nothing to report coming out of closed session. The first item, it's an action item, file item number 5, adoption of the February 22nd, 2018 meeting summary. Council members, there is a revised report, meeting summary, that is at your desk, and for those of you in the audience, there are copies on the back. A minor change was made to the last item related to the Water Master's quarterly report. So what's your pleasure?
So moved.
We have a motion to approve and a second. Any discussion? Let's vote.
Weinberg, aye.
Tatai and I.
Fiorini, aye.
Thompson, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. File item number 6, Chair's report. Do any council members have any reports of meetings that they have attended or
I had, in last month, I had given 2 presentations on behalf of the council in San Diego County, one to the Escondido Republican Club, and one to the monthly luncheon for the American Public Works Association, and my focus was really on, council activities and our Delta Plan amendments. So both got a lot of interest at both, a lot of good questions.
Good. Anyone else? 2 things I have to share with you. One is we found out yesterday that Senate Pro Tem President De Leon has made an appointment to fill the vacancy created by Patrick Johnston's term expiring. The appointment was made naming Maria Moranian from La Cañada. With the short notice, Maria was unable to revise her schedule to be with us today, but she will be joining us at the April meeting, and we look forward to serving with her. Among her many credits, she most recently has served as the chair of the Regional Water Quality Control Board in Los Angeles, and very familiar with water issues, and so we are looking forward to serving with Maria soon. Next item is the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. Planning efforts are underway. That meeting will occur in Sacramento on Monday, April 16th from 1 to 4 p.m. And our focus at that meeting will be on habitat restoration activities with a desire to have the 16 other agency leaders provide some guidance and offer some insights into what should be included in our Chapter 4 Delta Plan Ecosystem Chapter. We'll also be covering science under the title of One Delta One Science. Lead scientist Dr. John Callaway will be guiding the discussion that will be informing the council on updates to the science plan that's currently under review. So, any questions on the new appointment or DPIC? If not, then we will move on to file item number 7, and I'll call on our Acting Executive Officer, Jessica Law.
Good morning, council members. I'd like to start my report with an update on Delta Plan implementation activities. So since we last met, one cover to action was in public review and has passed without appeal. The California Department of Parks and Recreation, Division of Boating Waterways, on February 2nd certified its aquatic invasive plant control program consistent with the council's Delta Plan. It's an adaptively managed program designed to keep the waterways navigable by controlling the growth and spread of invasive aquatic plants in the Delta, its tributaries, and Sassoon Marsh. The program incorporates all previous Delta programs conducted by Boating and Waterways, including those for water hyacinth, sponge plant, and Egeria. Any new invasive plant species will be incorporated into this program as outlined in legislation passed in 2013. In addition, council staff submitted one comment letter in March related to implementation. So on March 2nd, we submitted a letter to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation on the draft feasibility report for Los Vaqueros Reservoir Expansion Project, Phase 2. The local project proponent, owner, and operator of Los Vaqueros is Contra Costa Water District, and they have acknowledged that this project is a covered action in its draft supplemental final EIR-EIS. We're also aware that the project is under review by the California Water Commission for potential state funding under Prop 1 Water Storage Investment Program. The council is in support of the Water Commission's process and efforts to review this and similar projects for potential funding. The district would also need to secure Delta Plan consistency certification to fulfill those water storage investment program funding requirements related to the project. So we'll continue to update you on that project as it moves forward. Quickly, I wanted to move on to some personnel announcements. So we are very happy to welcome a new staff member, Scott Navarro. He's an environmental scientist in the planning division. He graduated from Sacramento State and interned at the Solano County Water District, where he did water quality monitoring and assisted with other scientific studies. So at the council, Scott will be focusing on tracking ecosystem and water quality performance measures and support projects in the performance measures unit. We'd also like to welcome 2 new Sea Grant Fellows, Katerina and Mateo. They're in the audience. Katerina, if you could just stand up for a second and wave. Katerina she comes to the council. She's wrapping up her master's degree at Moss Landing Marine Labs, where she is in the Pacific Shark Research Center Ichthyology Lab. And she graduated cum laude from Wellesley University with a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and has extensive research experience. She's volunteered at the National Academies of Science in Philadelphia and then on research projects in Honduras and Panama. And we're very happy that she chose the Delta. So she will be assisting the Delta Independent Science Board as part of the Delta Science Program. In addition, Mateo Robbins, there he is. He's also joined the science program as a Sea Grant Fellow. He recently completed his PhD in ecology with a focus in interdisciplinary policy science studies from UC Davis. In addition to his doctorate, Mateo holds a Master's of Art in Psychology from Washington University in St. Louis, as well as a Bachelor's in Psychology and with minors in Mathematics and Spanish from Willamette University in Oregon. He has a strong set of quantitative social science research skills and will be a wonderful addition to the science program as we work to be leaders in integrating more human dimensions and social science work into our own work. So during the time of the program, he will be helping with the review and update of the Delta Science Plan and applying his social network analysis expertise and skills. So we are very happy to have them here. Up next, we have a legal update from Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council. First announcement is personnel in legal. I'll be sitting in this chair for the next few meetings while our chief counsel is away on leave. So assisting me today with the legal update is our legal intern, Rebecca Mills, who has a brief update on 2 recent court decisions and then a reminder about certain council rules regarding ex parte communications that follows from one of the court decisions. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Good morning, Council. On February 21st, in the California water curtailment cases, Santa Clara Court Superior Judge Brian Walsh addressed the legality of the notices sent out by the State Water Board in 2015 and resolved phase 1 of these 8 lawsuits that were coordinated in the Santa Clara Superior Court. Although the issue of recovery is technically moot, the court went ahead and discussed the Water Board's authority over enforcement actions, given that impending drought in California is foreseeable, and under the public interest exception, it was warranted. Although not entirely dispositive as to whether the Water Board may enforce these water rights, in all circumstances, the court held that the Water Board acted without authority when it issued the curtailment notices in 2015, because it did so under Water Code Section 1052. The court reasoned that the parties' pre-1914 rights fell outside of the statute's scope because the statute granted authority specifically to water rights that were authorized under the Water Code, and the parties' pre-1914 water rights predate the Water Code. So the curtailment notices were further found to violate due process, which is a new holding in the courts, for notice and opportunity to be heard on those underlying findings that the Water Board based the curtailment notices on. Although temporary, the court emphasized that water rights are property rights, and even a temporary deprivation are subject to the due process requirements. So phase 2 and 3 involve taking claims, and I believe those are still pending before the Santa Clara Superior Court. With respect to the water fix hearings, there's been a lot of action in the motion. A lot of motions have been filed to try to delay or stop the hearings on various grounds. One of the basis for the motions has gone to the Sacramento Superior Court in the County of Sacramento v. State Water Resources Control Board. And that's on the basis of, excuse me, the ex parte allegations. So the first motions that were filed with the Water Board sought to delay the hearing based on allegations of ex parte contact and communications between the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Board. Just days after those initial motions, the Department of Water Resources announced that the Central Valley and Southern California water agencies would not commit to the cost of the water fix project, as currently proposed, and started to discuss implementation of the water fix project in a staged phase approach. Again, motions were filed based on these potential changes to the project to delay or stop the hearings because the changes were significant and required, at least a modification to the hearings. On February 21st, the Water Board went ahead and ruled on both of these motions, finding that there had been no change in the project at this point, that the project is still a 2-tunnel, 3-intake project, and therefore the hearings could go ahead and move forward on that basis. And also that the ex parte allegations, although there were communications between DWR and the State Water Board, that they were proper in their role as a responsible agency under CEQA, and any that didn't fall within that realm were between staff at the Water Board, and therefore didn't fall under the category of an ex parte communication. That was the ruling that has been challenged in the Superior Court. in Sacramento Superior Court with a writ of mandate for an order that would require the Water Board to take action to remedy the ex parte communications before proceeding. The petitioner's request for a TRO was denied on March 5th by Judge James Argelis. There is still an outstanding request for preliminary and permanent injunctions, and a hearing on the writ is scheduled for May 25th. Then lastly, given all the discussion of ex parte allegations, legal wanted to remind the council of the administrative rules on ex parte communication that may be put in place. When an appeal is made to the Delta Stewardship Council, it triggers these communication restrictions on the council and all the members under the APA. These restrictions strive to preserve a transparent hearing process and requires notice and opportunity for all interested parties in any communication related to the appeal between an interested party and the council members. While an appeal is pending from the day it is filed until the final decision is reached, council members should not communicate with a party to the appeal or any other potentially interested person outside of the Delta Stewardship Council. However, if a council member receives a communication related to an issue in the pending appeal, please notify Bethany Payne or Andrew Torian in her absence or Jessica Law so that appropriate action may be taken. When an appeal is anticipated, legal may recommend that the council implement these ex parte restrictions as early as the completion of early consultation and no later than the filing date for the certificate of consistency. And legal will, once an appeal is pending, legal will update you further on these restrictions. Do you have any questions?
Any questions of Rebecca? Good report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Up next is our legislative report by Ryan Stambra.
Good morning. With the bill introduction deadline now behind us, policy committees have begun meeting in recent weeks, which will help to further sharpen the lens of bills that fall within the council's purview. Before jumping into specific bills this month, however, I wanted to note that in response to Judge Damrell's request from the February meeting, your binder should include district maps for both the Senate and Assembly, as well as a corresponding roster of current members. So hopefully you find that helpful. The first bill I'd like to discuss this morning is AB 2072 by Bill Quirk from Alameda. This bill would require the state board to establish a research program on the human and ecosystem health effects of constituents in water sources. These constituents, which the committee analysis estimates number in the hundreds of thousands and range from pharmaceuticals to fertilizers and food additives, amongst others, have been a research topic at the state board going back several years and have resulted in a handful of published reports, including one on the impact of these constituents on aquatic ecosystems. From this 2012 report, a series of recommendations were offered, which included recommending further research to better assess and identify specific constituents for future monitoring. As the council will recall, this recommendation is in line with the science program's current funding of monitoring efforts associated with the Sacramento wastewater treatment upgrade that we at the council have come to affectionately refer to as Operation Baseline. AB 2072 passed out of the Assembly's Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee last week and is now headed to appropriations, where available funding to support such research will be a major consideration. Moving on to SB 1035 by Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson from Santa Barbara, which would require a city or county to review climate adaptation and resiliency strategies when they update the housing element portion of their general plan. As currently drafted, this relatively straightforward bill is consistent with the long-range planning principles called for in the Delta Plan, and could potentially be strengthened by requiring municipalities to consider best available science in their approaches to climate adaptation and resiliency. SB 1035 is currently awaiting its first policy committee hearing in Senate Governance and Finance. And then moving on to AB 2348 by Assemblymember Aguiar Curry, whose 4th district represents portions of 5 counties, including Solano and Yolo. Historically, some rice farmers have been willing to flood their fields in the winter to provide wetland habitat for waterfowl and fish species, which has provided demonstrable environmental benefits. For instance, recent studies have shown that access to the food-rich environment of flooded rice plains in places like the Yolo Bypass have made for productive rearing habitat for juvenile Chinook salmon. However, with the cost of water increasing in recent years, there is concern that some farmers will turn to more cost-effective ways to prepare their fields for the upcoming growing season. As a result, the Assembly member is currently developing AB 2348, which was just amended yesterday, and would allow the Department of Fish and Wildlife to enter into contracts with rice farmers to manage the lands under the department's Waterfowl Habitat Incentive Payment Program as a means to continue to encourage this practice. It should be noted that this concept is similar to a bill that the Audubon Society sponsored last year that would have provided a temporary tax credit for such practice. However, the bill ultimately failed to pass the Assembly Appropriations Committee, in part because it was projected to have at least a $10 to $15 million annual fiscal impact on the general fund. And then before moving on to my presentation, I wanted to note that the Council's Executive Fellow, Seth Yund, who I believe is sitting behind me, is currently looking at a similar topic to encourage wildlife-friendly farming practices, and is planning to appear before the Council next month to discuss the premise of his work, so more to come on that topic. And then the final piece of state legislation I'd like to mention this morning is an update on Assembly Member Jim Frazier's AB 1876, which, as you may recall, previously proposed to reshape the council to add additional representation from the Delta region. The bill was amended earlier this month and would now place a sunset on the council of July 2020, and after that date would provide for the council and its authority to be absorbed into the Delta Protection Commission. The bill is currently anticipated to be heard in Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife in early April, where I plan to be in attendance and will provide the council with any updates at next month's meeting. And then turning to news quickly on Capitol Hill, where the concept of raising Shasta Dam has once again come up under the Trump administration. In fact, until this past Tuesday, House Majority leadership were planning to add a rider to a must-pass budget bill, which would have exempted the project from current federal law that requires states to share in the cost of such a project, thereby, in theory, allowing the project to move forward. However, House Democrats whose support will be required to pass this spending bill have ultimately opposed the inclusion of this rider, based at least in part on a letter from Secretary Laird sent to congressional leaders last week, urging the rejection of the proposal and citing its conflict with state law. As a result, it appears likely that the current spending bill will move forward without the Shasta expansion language. And then the last item I just wanted to briefly note, as I've talked about in recent meetings with regards to the council's budget proposal, the council is currently scheduled to go before the Assembly and Senate budget subcommittees April 4th and 5th, where we will have an opportunity to state the reasoning and the need for our proposal, and I look forward to coming back next month and providing an update on the outcome there. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report.
Any questions of Ryan? Yes.
Just great report, Ryan. Appreciate it. Just a couple of questions on some of the legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, the 2053 and what was it, 2348. So I think we talked about 2053 last month. I mean, both of these seem very basic to the mission of the council, and just wondering about how, how we can more visibly, support these efforts, or just put our, kind of linkage to the Delta plan. It just seems, and maybe this is a question for the chair and the other council members, is that we've, typically, my experience is, you've got somebody that's working with the author who's moving these concepts forward. It just seems so central to what we do, and would like to suggest that we try and be more vocal and visible in our support, that we're trying to accomplish these things. These things are part and parcel to us moving the ball forward. So, I mean, these seem to be pretty basic. I'm wondering whether, I think some months ago we talked about supporting specific pieces of legislation. These things, I mean, it's our equivalent of, mom and apple pie. Can we entertain staff coming back with, or a council position on these two bills? I mean, we talk about these things constantly. It seems like a good opportunity to encourage the legislature to help us.
And Eric, that's a great point. That's why I argued that when bills come before the legislature, we ought to weigh in on those bills that help move our agenda forward. And this is a prime example of one of those bills that we should be vocal. We should, as a council, support this bill and make sure the legislature knows it. Thank you.
I think our history has been not to take a lot of positions. Legislation changes from day to day, and it requires a lot of monitoring. So we have often resorted to weighing in on a bill like this and simply highlighting that it is, in this case, something that is in keeping with Delta Plan recommendations, and cite the Delta Plan as the basis for supporting this type of an approach or this type of an action, without delving into support or oppose position on legislation. So I'd be happy to pen a letter to the author of this bill indicating the Stewardship Council's position relative to recommendations in the Delta Plan. That would be in keeping with what we've done in the past. Susan?
I'm recalling, I don't remember which council meeting it was, but Ryan, didn't you give us documentation of the current procedures or protocols that we follow on supporting or opposing a bill, and how we decide?
That is correct. I believe we finalized that legislative policy at the September 2017 council meeting. And basically, the council has the discretion to take a position at whether it's at a meeting at a meeting such as this, or certainly staff could come back and provide a more focused briefing on the pros and cons, and within that can include a staff recommendation that the council could then consider for further action as well.
Well, I think given the way that legislation is moved and changed and the dynamic aspect of it, since you're at the Capitol most of the time, I like the idea that you advise us on the timing of when it is best to indicate support, whether that is through a letter or having you testify or something more formal. But I think, sometimes it's so unpredictable. So I really like that you be our eyes and ears, and you help us decide, and and you recommend to us when is the best time for us to be the most vocal.
Is it possible, Mr. Chair, if we can get a little more in-depth report on the two bills that you're interested in? Is that right?
Yeah, these two.
Yeah. Well, I just think we need more than a synopsis of the bill. We need to get some information, who supports, who's opposed, and, you know, we normally would get, when you go to any board to take a position, that's important. And also any potential amendments to the bill, and the bill's history. And that kind of information, I think, is essential. If we get that, then I think I have no problem taking positions. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate. But I'd just like to have more information about it, that's all.
You've heard the request, and I would add to that, any reports coming back to the council regarding legislation should have a linkage to the Delta Plan. I always feel comfortable expressing our positions based on what we have already approved. That's sort of our foundational document. So in these two cases, the linkage to the Delta Plan and a reminder of what it is that we have been recommending.
It would be helpful, I think, if we had a reference directly to language in the Delta Plan, that how the effect that these bills would have on that language. That would be helpful too. I think that's a very important point.
Can I just make sure I understand, or staff has clear direction would this be coming back to us at next month's meeting with a more detailed report on these pieces of legislation? And maybe if I could add to having the science program also help with that report to tell us how that relates to the science action plan, and, you know, and whether this is fundamental to what we've been trying to accomplish. Thank you.
All right, direction seems pretty clear.
It is. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I'd like to move on to item number 7C. This is a request for authority for a contract, and I'd like to invite Reiner Hoenecke, the Deputy Executive Officer for the Science Program, and Nir Oxenberg, who's a staff member who's working on this contract, and just invite them to join us at the front table if there are any questions by council members. So the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Contract, I'm requesting authority to enter into a 2-year contract for $700,066,158 with the University of California, Davis to continue publication of the quarterly San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal, or SFUS, as we often call it. The contract exceeds the delegated authority granted to the executive officer. There's a staff report in your council packet on this item. I'd like to say that this journal has been around since at least 2003. It's a long-standing journal that supports research in the Delta. It is issued quarterly and occasionally includes special issues. For instance, last year, or 2 years ago now, 2016, they did a special issue on State of Bay Delta Science, which is one of the core components of our Delta Science program strategy to issue this long-term synthesis report. Anyways, and then that's just my brief overview. If you have any more questions, we're happy to answer them.
Any questions on the recommendation? Skip.
Just for the benefit of the public, could you talk about the other partners that are involved in this publication? It's just not our effort, there are others involved.
That's correct, there are. Reiner, would you like to talk about the other one?
I certainly would be glad to.
Thanks.
Good morning, council members. We do have a collaborative relationship with the California Digital Library that's under UC, with the USGS and with UC Davis. So USGS contributes in-kind services through the chief editor, Dr. Sam Luoma, and UC Davis is providing administrative support, digital software support, and other functions that we rely on. So our estimate for the in-kind service proportion of the whole effort is roughly a little less than $400,000 a year. So it's substantial. Neil, do you have any additional details?
Any other questions? Do we have a request for public comment? All right, you've heard the recommendation. What's your pleasure?
If there are no other questions, Mr. Chair, I'll move it.
Okay. Moved in second. Any discussion on the motion? Yes, Susan.
Just curious, I'm looking at this excellent chart of the frequency that folks download, and this is an extremely useful publication. Over the years, I've read it, and it's written in a manner that is accessible to the layperson. It's very informative. But I was just curious, the peaks in downloads seem to be often in the second and fourth quarter of the year. Is that what's going on?
That tends to be the function of when the next volume comes out. So as soon as the email goes out that the new edition has been published, then lots of people click on the link and download it, and then and then it slows down until the next edition comes out.
So it's not as though there's some earth-shattering finding that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good point. Ready for the question? Let's proceed with the vote.
Weinberg, aye.
Tatai, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Thompson, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Next
Okay.
item.
Thank you, council members. I'd like to call up Lindsay Correa, Program Manager in the Delta Science Program, and Reiner, you're welcome to stay. The next is also a request, requesting authority to approve an amendment to a contract. This is with the Water Board, the State Water Resources Control Board. It's the Water Board Reimbursable Agreement Contract Amendment. And I am requesting authority to approve the amendment to the existing reimbursable agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board to increase the amount from $510,000 to $1 million, over $1 million, and extend the term of the agreement to March 31st, 2020. There's a staff report also on this item in the council packet, and both Reiner and Lindsay are here to answer any questions that the council members have about this reimbursable agreement.
You've heard the recommendation. Any questions? Do we have a request for public comment? No? What's your pleasure?
Staff recommendation.
Okay.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Question?
Weinberg, aye.
Tatai, aye.
Fiorini, aye. Motion passes unanimously.
All right, thank you very much.
Lindsay, thank you.
All right, thank you, council members. I just want to note there's a few, so we are in the third quarter of our fiscal year, and so the next few months there's going to be a lot of activity at council meetings around contracts and bids. And I wanted to announce that over the next coming days we're going to be releasing bids for two projects that I'm very excited about. They relate very much directly to our 2018 council priorities. The first is a request for a proposal. This is a solicitation for a climate vulnerability assessment. I think we had talked about this at the December meeting, but this vulnerability assessment would really help us gather information across the region, across the 5 counties and the cities within it, to really have a much better understanding of climate change impacts and potential strategies for adaptation across the region. So that will be released publicly very soon, within the next week. And then today we will be releasing a request for proposals for an integrated modeling study to help support the work that the Integrated Modeling Steering Committee is doing. If you remember, this is something that we've been working on since 2016, since the Science Enterprise Workshop. It's a part of the council priorities and also one of the 5 actions identified in the Science Action Agenda, something that's very important. And so we're very excited to release this and get proposals and solicitations back on these 2 projects. So I'll be coming back to you at later in the fiscal year at the May or the June meeting with information about bids that we received and a request. Other than that, that concludes the executive officer's report, unless there's any questions for me.
Any questions of Jessica?
No?
Great,
Okay,
thank you
thanks so
very
much.
much. Susan, you reminded me on the cause and effect question you had related to the circulation of the Estuary News, that it has been observed by some that there is a relationship between council meetings and rain. You may recall at our last meeting in February, the only day it rained was on the day of the council meeting, so I just offered that up. There must be a scientific reason, so with that, we'll call on our lead scientist, Dr. John Callaway.
Okay, well, yeah.
With the chair.
As everyone, we always have said, correlation is no sign of causation. So, I appreciate your support for SVUES. Actually, the first, the article I'm going to talk about came out of SVUES, and as you know, many of the articles that we talk about do come out, so it is definitely a really valuable, important journal. Before I start in on that, I want to mention, previously last month I mentioned the Lobo Report, and you know there are questions always about the reports we do about how they're being used after the reports are done. Just last week I was at the IEP directors meeting, and there was discussion about the sampling methods for the Delta smelt, and they referred specifically to the Lobo review that we supported and how that's been being incorporated immediately by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service into this year's plans for sampling. So I think our reports definitely are having an effect. And the other thing to note is it's not just rain, but it's the beginning of spring. So Tuesday was the first day of spring. So we've moved out of winter, and you'll hear about the numbers by the numbers. Luckily, I think we're getting some more rainfall that hopefully will bring us closer to a reasonably wet year. So with that, I'll tell you about, I'll start with the report that is in your binder, or that's in the summary there about subsidence issues. So last month, we talked about potential flooding of Delta Islands and their value as aquatic habitat, that John Durand was the lead author on and is here and is going to talk about the drought work that he and many others have been working on. But in that same issue, there's another article about the subsidence issues within the Delta. This focuses on Twitchell Island, where a lot of work has been done to do subsidence reversal and carbon accumulation by water management. And so the question that was posed by Steve Deverell and his co-authors in this paper was to really look at how do those managed wetlands or rice production affect water seepage from the river into the islands? How does it, and then what are the implications of that? And so what he did was they have long-term data there from Twitchell Island on water levels within the island versus water levels in the river, as well as a number of soil samples to look at the characteristics of the soil that would affect how water movement is occurring. They incorporated that into a number of different models to look at water flow under different scenarios or different conditions. And what they were able to show is that what you would expect, if you keep the water level high in the island, there's much less movement of water across the levee. And so the flooded conditions associated with managed wetlands or rice reduce water flow across the levee, and that water flow weakens the levee, so it helps to maintain and support the levees. The challenging issue that they point out with doing that is that in addition to reducing the flow across the levee, it does increase the concentration of organic carbon in the water itself, because the water's they're in the soil in contact with highly organic rich soils that are in those islands. And then that water, if it's dumped into the river, has impacts for water quality with high dissolved oxygen concentrations, can combine with chlorides or other halogens and create trihalomethanes that would have significant water quality problems.
So they do acknowledge that issue. They point out that with water control efforts, that can be managed. And so they're just really identifying that managing the water in those islands could promote levee stability, and that although dissolved oxygen, although dissolved organic carbon could be an issue, that there are mitigating ways to manage that. And then having the water on the island also does reduce oxidation of the soils, and so reduce further subsidence of the soils. So, any questions? Okay, so the next point to summarize is brown bag seminars. So we've had a series of 3 brown bag seminars earlier this winter on ecosystem services. And we've talked about ecosystem services before. Remember, ecosystem, people refer to the concept of ecosystem goods and services. Those are the things, the goods, the materials that ecosystems produce. And then the services are those dynamics or those processes that an ecosystem provides that provide for human benefit. They're things like water purification, storm protection. So previously I talked about an article on the value of coastal wetlands for reducing storm impacts. That's a real good example of ecosystem services. And this is a relatively new field. In the last few decades, it's been developed. And the challenge is that economic tools really are mostly geared toward evaluating things where there's a clear market for the value of them. For ecosystem services, there is no market. There's no market for evaluating storm reduction. And so it takes very different methods. And those methods are being developed, but many of them are challenging to evaluate and develop. But I think there's a lot of progress in that area. And so we wanted to host a series of brown bags around ecosystem services and how they might be applied in the Delta. So the 3 presenters that we had were Irina Dronova, Van Bootzik, and Ben Bryant. Ben Bryant's from Stanford University. Irina and Van are both from UC Berkeley. And they acknowledged that many of these tools are now just being developed. So it's not as though there's a whole complete toolbox that's simple and easy to use to go out and evaluate ecosystem services, but more and more tools are being developed. They highlighted a series of tools that probably are the most sophisticated that are available currently that Stanford University has developed that's called Invest software. And the Invest software is, integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. What it does is it uses landscape scale data, so you can look at current land uses, current vegetation communities, water flow, all the different kinds of information that you would incorporate into a GIS system, and use that to help identify places where current ecosystem services are being provided in terms of all the things like I've mentioned: storm protection, carbon sequestration, water purification. And then most importantly, you can evaluate different scenarios. So you can say, okay, if we take this area and convert it to a certain use, how would ecosystem services be changed? And what kind of benefits could we have with that? So it's really most useful as a tool for planning, for trade-offs, to look at what are the different, where might we, if we have options for restoration or operations for different kind of land management, where could we get the best opportunity for that? Where do we lose the least existing services and gain new benefits? Some things that Irina pointed out was really that we do need to think about the wide mix of services, so different kinds of habitats, different kinds of ecosystems, different kinds of human land use provide different benefits, and we really should be looking at a mix of different kinds of land use so that we get a mix of different benefits. And then Van and Ben really both focused on the use of this Invest tool and how it really is most useful, as I mentioned, in these trade-offs. Van gave an example of a simple evaluation of where to highlight conservation issues, where to purchase land or make conservation efforts in the Napa region on a project that he's been working on. And those similar kinds of efforts would be useful within the Delta. So any questions?
What was the size of the parcel it says a parcel in Napa County. Was-
Small, I think
Very small.
hundreds of acres, not enormous. Hundreds to 1,000, I think. So it was really a focused local case study. It wasn't a broad-scale regional planning effort. But it could be used for that. Any other questions? Okay. So the next item to highlight is our highest priority for this year that we've already mentioned to you, but I just wanted to give you a brief update, and that's the review and update to the Delta Science Plan. And that we started at the beginning of the year. Staff has spent a lot of time identifying how we feel we could improve the document and where there's areas to strengthen it. We've already done, actually not we, but Yumi Korea and Yumi Henneberry and Lindsay Korea have led this effort, and especially Yumi. She's done a lot of outreach to all of the different organizations around the Delta already to get immediate feedback on what their highest priority issues are. We've incorporated that, and we're about to put together a draft current update that will be the basis of a discussion for a public workshop on April 6th. And so that we're doing targeted outreach and broad invitations to stakeholders. So anyone that you know that might be interested, encourage them to attend on April 6th. We will be getting focused feedback on the different areas of the science plan update. If you recall the way it's set up, there's action items of things that we're trying to achieve. So we'll be getting specific input on various action items. If we're missing areas where we should be adding action items, if there's other topics that we should be including. So that effort is moving forward. We also met a few weeks ago with our local Science Advisory Committee and got feedback from the Science Advisory Committee and how we could improve the plan prior to the public workshop. And then we'll be meeting again with them later, as well as others throughout the summer and fall. The plan is that in the summer there will be a revised draft, a complete draft. The current draft is really a working draft. So there'll be a revised draft that will go out for written public input, and then it will also go to the Independent Science Board for their review before it comes to you, probably at the end of the year or very first thing next year. Any questions on the science plan update? Okay. The next item is related to a report on the feasibility of ballast water treatment, and this is an effort that the science program has facilitated to develop a report on behalf of the California State Lands Commission to evaluate the feasibility of onshore treatment of ballast water. So I think you probably all realize ballast water is the water dumped out of ships or used as a stabilizing feature for ships. When it's dumped in the delta or in the estuary, whatever is in that water potentially brings in invasive species or non-native species, and has been shown to be the source of many of the non-native species that currently exist within the bay and delta. And so there's an enormous interest to try to reduce that. And California has set up interim standards for treating wastewater that are the most stringent of anywhere in the country to reduce that. So the challenge is, how do we meet those interim standards? Doing the treatment of the ballast water on board the ship is really not feasible. And so this report was to evaluate the feasibility of removing the ballast water from the ship and then treating it on land. And what was identified in the report was that the most feasible, the most cost-effective way to do it would be actually with barges. So rather than pump it on land, have a series of barges, about 25 barges across the state in different ports, and they would take on the ballast water, and then it would be treated and filtered or treated with UV to kill all of to filter out or kill all of the organisms before the water is discharged. So that the report is just about complete. And actually, it says in your update there that a final report has been delivered to the State Lands Commission. In fact, the final report was delivered to us. We've given feedback to the authors, and the final report will probably be delivered in the next week or two. So we have given the State Lands Commission a courtesy copy of the summary, but they have not received the full report. But we'll update you when that full report is given, I'm sure, before our next meeting. And so we facilitated both the report, and then to ensure the quality of it, there was an independent review panel that met with the authors 3 times over the last 3 years to give them feedback and to evaluate the quality of the report. And I think in the end, they all agreed that this ballot, using these barges is truly the most effective way to do it. The next steps are that a pilot project, assuming that the State Lands Commission agrees with this, then they will set up a pilot project to develop a few barges and to test it over the coming years, with implementation of the full network probably taking 8 to 10 years. Questions?
Dr. Callaway, I think you've answered my question. Would State Lands be funding this pilot program initially?
The state would, I assume, through State Lands, yes.
Through State Lands, because it could be rather expensive.
It is expensive. So the full implementation is about $500 million to build the barges. So it's not a cheap effort. The pilot project probably is just a handful of barges, but would be tens of millions.
And just as a reminder, the legislation that directed the Lands Commission to do this is over 10 years old now.
Yeah, it's been a long process. Okay, so I think it's good that it's finally coming to a completion, and now it will be State Land's opportunity to move the ball forward. Okay, the last 2 items are some brief announcements. One is of the Bay Delta Science Conference that, as you've heard many times, I think it's really the highlight of the science year and really the highlight of 2 years. It only happens every 2 years. It'll be this September 10th and 12th in Sacramento. The theme for the conference is Our Estuary at an Intersection, similar to the theme of the 2017 annual report for the Stewardship Council. And the idea is really a mix of issues at that intersection, at the intersection of river and the bay, at the intersection of policy and science, at the intersection of all kinds of challenging issues. And it's a 3-day conference. It will feature a mix of different speakers. Actually, your chair, Randy Fiorini, will be one of the speakers. And it definitely is a true highlight. I think I encourage you to try to attend if you could for at least a day. There's a mix of science and policy presentations, so lots of interesting presentations, and a real effort to bring in students and young scientists as well. And for those of you either here in the audience or listening, I encourage you to put in an abstract. April 23rd, abstracts are due, so not too far away. And then the last thing to mention is that we have made finalized decisions on the Delta Science Fellows for 2018. We had many strong applications, and we were able to award 9 fellows, 5 PhD students, and 4 postdocs. And you have in your binder a list of the awardees. I won't read all of the awardees, but I will highlight that they come from a mix of universities, many UCs, since it's a PhD-focused program, UC Berkeley, UC Merced, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, and the University of Washington, all students or postdocs from those institutions. I think what's really unique about this program is it's both an academic and sort of a management-focused fellowship, so the students or postdocs who receive the awards have to have both an academic mentor at their home university as well as a community mentor at an agency or nonprofit, so that we're sure that their work is really connected to management issues and that they're getting some mentorship in that regard. So some of the mentors, Steve Deverell, who was the lead author on the paper on subsidence, is one of the community mentors. He's a local consultant who's long been involved with Delta issues. Other mentors come from the U.S. Geological Survey, from NOAA, from Metropolitan Water District, and from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So there's a broad range of topics as well. The topics were really driven by the Science Action Agenda that set the priorities for what the kinds of projects we wanted to fund. But the students and postdocs are looking at things like contaminants and pollutants, of course at fish, at food web issues, carbon dynamics, endangered species, so a broad range. And so I think sometime before long, you'll have an opportunity to meet some of them. I know in the past you've had a chance to hear presentations from them, and we aren't going to do that immediately, but sometime while they're working on their fellowships, you'll have that opportunity. So any questions on that?
In the past, they have come and given us each a brief summary of the work that they're doing, and it's an impressive group and a wonderful program.
Yeah.
It's just, it's one of the ways that the council develops leadership and provides for succession planning. And
Yes.
it's a big deal these days in every industry, and this is a major investment on the part of the
It is.
council, and it is serving us well.
And actually, I should mention, I forgot to mention, in addition to our support, SWFCA, the state and federal contractors water agency, supported one of the 9 fellows. And Sea Grant is a key sponsor as well, and that we work with them, and they provide all of the support, all the administrative support to review applications and all of that. And I should also acknowledge Neer, who you'll hear from in just a second, Neer Oxenberg, who in our office really facilitated all this work and put a lot of effort into the whole process.
Any questions of Dr. Callaway? And thank you.
Great. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Neer, and Neer will give you our by the numbers report.
Good morning, and happy World Water Day. You may have seen some headlines recently mentioning a March miracle or March mitigation, whatever you want to call it. We got some rain and snow. It has been a relatively wet March, especially compared with the prior months. For example, as of yesterday, we are at 74% of average precipitation in the Northern Sierra. At this time last month, we were at 59%. I want to take a minute to further look at precipitation because we actually have some rain and snow worth talking about. This graph is the way that some water wonks like to look at the data because it allows you to visualize the current water year compared to averages as well as extreme events. It is updated daily, and if you can see the screen in the middle or the big screen over there, the dark blue line in the middle shows the current cumulative inches of precipitation. This is for the Northern Sierra. The long-term average is in light blue, and a few key water years, including the very wet 2016-2017 water year, is in green up top, and the recent drought is in red. This chart is from yesterday morning. As of this morning, we actually moved up to 32.2 inches, which is 78% of the average to date of the Northern Sierra. As a side note, if you're curious about the storm in Southern California, the Tulare Basin received about 2.7 inches since yesterday, and it's now at 56% of the average, compared to just yesterday when it was at 46% of average. The reason I wanted to show this chart is because it really helps show the impact that March has had on this year's water year. Before that, before March, you could see we were essentially flatlining towards a critically dry water year. Well, after March, it's not as drastic anymore. You can still see we are well below average. If we look at snowpack, as of yesterday, we are at 49% of the statewide average, which is still low, but not nearly as low as last month when we were at 20% for statewide average. If we move on to water supply, the reservoir storages remain at average with the exception of Oroville. And if we move on to flow, there were some increases in flows and diversions from last month. Last month, diversions were at 4,800 CFS. They increased to 5,568 this month, which is 86% of the average amount for this time of year. This chart shows 13 months of flow averages from March 2017 through March 2018. The take-home message is that diversions remain relatively stable compared to fluctuations in flows from the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers throughout the year. To briefly touch on salinities, the take-home message is that they remain very similar to last month. Let's move on to fish. A total of 15 Delta smelt were caught from January through March during the spring Kodiak trawl. Of these 15 fish, 14 of them were caught in January and February, so only one was caught during the March survey. The 17-year average is 385, and by this time last year, 35 Delta smelt were caught. The chart below shows the number of smelt caught in January through March during the spring Kodiak trawl over the last 17 years. I think the trend is pretty clear that the smelt numbers have not rebounded. And since I don't want to end on a bummer, it's a March miracle. Are there any questions?
Mr. Chair.
Near, we have a question.
Near, not for you specific, for Dr. Callaway. And I believe it was one of the articles in our binder this month. It talked about maybe the Delta smelt wasn't the appropriate species to be focusing on. Maybe it should be another species. Do you have a comment or a thought on that?
Yeah, so I think they were trying, that was in the blog post that came out a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
There was a series of posts on broader scale efforts to address issues within the ecosystem issues within the Delta, and mostly they were trying to make the case that we shouldn't be looking at one single species, we should be looking at a mix of species. And I agree with that. The challenge is endangered species, definitely we have to focus on those listed species, but we should be looking at a mix. So I think it's not just that it's not the Delta smelt is the wrong species, it's that it's the Delta smelt plus other species that we should be considering.
That was a good explanation. Thank you. Anything else for Near? Yes. Susan?
My mic doesn't, okay, I'll just hold the button down. I'm curious what happens to the fish that are caught.
A lot of them, since the Delta smelt are quite fragile and little, a lot of them don't make it, which is rough because we were running very low on Delta smelt, and then we have to catch them to know how many we have, but then a lot of them don't make it, but we are required to see how many we have and to go through the surveys. John, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I'll add, they're more valuable than gold, I would say. They don't make it, but they are used for all kinds of analysis. So they look at their otoliths. There's a bone in their ear that they can use to identify how old they are. They can identify where by looking at the chemical composition of that, they can identify where they've spent time, so they can see, not exactly, but they can identify what the salinity was, where they spent the earlier part of their life, so they can identify, are they fish that spent more time in freshwater? Are they ones that spent more time in Sassoon or in slightly higher salinities? They look at their gut content, so they take the tiny little fish, take out their gut, they look to see what they've been eating so that they can learn more about, because clearly one of the challenging issues is food resources for them, so they can get some more information. So they are used extensively to learn more about the species so that we can hopefully do something to improve their conditions. But yeah, as Nir said, there's just so few being caught right now that it's definitely a challenge.
Anything else? John? Hold on.
That's all.
Okay, great. Any requests for public comment on this matter? No. All right, that concludes file item number 8. On to file item number 9, lessons on drought. Jessica?
Thank you. I'd like to invite Yumi Henneberry from the Delta Science Program, Dr. John Duran, and Amber Manfrey from UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences to present this item.
Good morning, council members. Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to introduce, again, Drs. John Durand and Amber Manfrey, who jointly led the development of the synthesis report, Drought in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, 2012 to 2016, Synthesis Reviews and Lessons. This report was funded by the Delta Stewardship Council through the Delta Science Program, and a final manuscript is near completion, and a near final executive summary has been provided to you. Dr. Durand is a senior researcher with the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences with expertise in ecology and conservation of estuaries, and is the lead author of the report. Dr. Manfrey is a postdoctoral scholar at the UC Davis Center for Watershed Science with expertise in Sassoon marsh ecology and human interactions. This effort was initiated, as a reminder, in response to topic 1A of the 2015 High Impact Science Actions, which called for a guiding document to provide both managers and scientists with lessons learned from the past drought to offer insights for future management and planning. As a reminder, the High Impact Science Actions is a list of high-priority cross-agency issues for near-term implementation requested for by the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee upon accepting the interim science action agenda developed through leadership of the Delta Science Program. The Delta Science Program requested the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences to take on the synthesis task given their range of expertise in critical water challenges. Drs. Durand and Manfrey put together an interdisciplinary team of 13 authors with expertise ranging from biology, agriculture, engineering, to human ecology. And I also had an opportunity to contribute a very small portion. To ensure a well-rounded perspective, the science program also coordinated a planning team with a diverse membership. This included the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the California Department of Water Resources, the California State Water Resources Control Board, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and the Bay Institute to shape the scope of the work for the report and to also provide suggestions for individuals to interview. Several interviews were conducted with a range of individuals representing federal and state entities, public water agencies, academic scientists, and residents with agricultural and recreational interests. These interviews were extremely valuable and offered a diverse set of perspectives. The synthesis report also went through an extensive review process with the planning committee members, their peers, and those interviewed providing input on multiple drafts to maintain accuracy and to remain within scope. I would also like to note that this was a very challenging task requiring analysis of an extremely complex network of managing bodies layered over an already complex Delta system. And I would really like to acknowledge John and Amber and their co-authors for their hard work and dedication, as well as the members of the planning committee and those that were interviewed. This informational presentation is a follow-up to the presentation provided to you in October of last year, where the Delta Water Master, the Office of Emergency Services, and the authors before you provided overviews of drought-related reports that were either being initiated or were already underway. Dr. Durand provided a high-level overview of the synthesis, highlighting key topic areas and messages, and today he will provide you with highlights of findings that are most pertinent to the council. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Yumi. I just want to say that Yumi is very modest about this, as she contributed quite a lot to the report, and she's provided an amazing service to us in putting together this report, both in terms of providing literature, liaison between the Delta Science Program and the Council, and overall shepherding of the many sheep that we're working on this project. And so, or not really sheep, cats, isn't that the expression? Shepherding cats. So I just want to sing her praises. She's been really an effective coordinator for us. As well as Amber Manfrey, who's been working with me on this intensively for the past many months. And so just to give you a little bit more background, to just kind of riff off of what Yumi told you, is we were asked by the Delta Science Program, we were commissioned by the Delta Science Program to put together some researchers from UC Davis. And this consisted of about a dozen of us from different departments, from civil engineering, from environmental sciences, from ecology, and all the participants generally had a seat at the Center for Watershed Sciences, which is a center at the university. It's dedicated to interdisciplinary research, and so we have members in many departments across campus, and including the UC Ag and Natural Resources Center down in Stockton. We had Michelle Leinfelder-Miles contributing as well. So we had a diverse, and she was contributing on ag concerns in the Delta. And so we had a really diverse portfolio of authors and knowledge that was contributed to this. And it needed that because the Delta, as you know, is just more complicated than one or two or three people can understand. And so using this diverse group of people, we had everyone write sections, and then we tried to integrate it into a cohesive whole. Today, what I'd like to do for you is summarize what we talked about in October, address what it is we are charged with, and I encourage you to interrupt me and ask questions. I have a tendency to talk too fast when getting excited. So slow me down, ask questions, and we can fill up an hour more effectively that way, discussing the report. So our charge was to look at the effect, not to look at the effects of drought per se, but to parse it out a little more closely and look at the effects of management decisions and actions that were taken to manage the drought, and the effects on ecosystem, ag, and economy. And in addition to that, to figure out what kind of science needs we had going into the future so that we could anticipate future droughts, which are bound to come, and also climate change, because this really is practice for long-term trends that seem to be manifesting. Our predictions for climate change, just to give you context, are not necessarily a decrease in precipitation, but an increase in temperature, a decrease in snowpack, and an increase in the extremes. We expect to see more years like 2014, 2015, and 2017, that difference between dryness and flood. So we looked at this as, not only drought management assessment, but also practice for climate change. And so there's a huge body of literature that's been accumulated by various agencies and government groups, and Yumi compiled much of it for us and presented it to us. And there's a problem with that level of transparency. It's so much material that's so wordy and so uncurated that it almost creates more opacity. There are multiple websites and links that are dead-end. It's like running through a maze, trying to get access to information. And it's a central problem. And the documents themselves are meant for the moment. They're meant to interpret a great deal of information, addressing questions in the moment, and providing context, background, so they tend to be very repetitive, and they have a little bit at the very end that's informative at that moment in time. And so I want to start out this way because to cut past that, we use these interviews as a way, sort of an entree into what the major issues were throughout the drought. And we went back and used these documents to support the information that we received from the interviews, which was often contradictory, and there were a lot of uncertainties that came out of the interviews because people are still processing what happened, and there are a lot of different perspectives. A lot of the perspectives are tied in with different agencies' charge. Some agencies have a mandate to provide water with a focus on human use. Some agencies have a mandate to protect wildlife. And so their perspectives got filtered through that lens. And so we tried to go through and parse out the differences and figure out where people were coming from. And we tried to provide a balanced recommendation in our synthesis. So that was our approach. This drought, the Water Masters report, and other reports are a great attempt to try to reconstruct the history of this event. But one of the recommendations I have is that we have an ongoing science and policy historian who will archive documents and information as they come out, so that as the process unfolds, we have somebody documenting this. We have Maven. Maven's notebook is terrific, but it tends to be, it doesn't have that sense of continuity. What we really need is someone or a group of people working on grabbing the documents as they emerge, archiving them in a coherent way with titles and metadata that tells us what they address, and then creating a narrative that's ongoing. And this would be a very powerful instrument for Delta management and science, because it would tell us what we've done and who else is doing things, and we don't always know that. We don't always, the right hand isn't sure about the left hand. And so this is one of the most important recommendations, I think, not just for advancing drought, but advancing the inter-drought periods and the science that we need overall to be able to manage the system. So I think that's the general overview of our process and that key lesson that came out of it for us. And any questions about that so far? Okay, I'll press on. And so that being the process, the initial results that we talked about last October, which I just want to touch on briefly to remind you, were that the importance of increased lines of communication among agencies, among the directors of agencies. Some of these issues were addressed through the RT-DOT, the Real-Time Drought Operations Team, and a number of other groups that met together regularly to make decisions about how to manage the system. In the case of the RT-DOT, they met during the crisis period. They met weekly, even bi-weekly. And these were high-level managers. And and they often had different perspectives and conflicts, which they tried to resolve. But all too often, the discussion that occurred during the RT-DOT didn't seem to trickle down to the mid-level or managers or the folks, the operators who were going to implement these decisions. And they were left, those individuals at the lower ends, the implementation end, were often left to make decisions for themselves because they were controversial, because the upper level management didn't really know how to approach it. And so folks at the lower ends were really charged with making decisions that were supported in a post hoc way by the higher level managers. And we would like to see the level of communication, I would like to see the level of communication increased between the upper level managers, the lower level managers, and also among agencies where those individuals work. And that's something that's one of our chief recommendations in terms of creating a drought management plan, that we have some kind of a mechanism that we can rely on to increase those levels. Randy, I can tell you want to ask me something.
Do you have an example? High level, low level?
Yeah,
operating decision?
I do, but I don't want to use it because I feel like if I start naming names and pointing out, so here's my rationale. If I start naming names right now, people are going to start becoming really reactionary to the report.
No, I don't want you to go there.
We want people to come in and accept the recommendations and then go through working with agency folks who know this is an issue to increase transparency. And so I'm a little reluctant to just say, okay, it was this group.
Okay,
but I do have examples.
So you're referring to reservoir operations?
I'm talking about reservoir operations. I'm talking about wildlife management agencies. I'm talking about how they work together.
Okay.
The big players in the room are NIMFS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau, and Department of Water Resources, and also Cal Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
So they're the 5 groups. It's the 5 group members, that form the RT-DOT.
Okay. So you're primarily talking about the state and the federal water operations, because my experience at the local level is quite the opposite. It's the frontline people that are advising the decision makers as to how to operate a reservoir. So what you described is sort of.
No, it's actually exactly the same, actually. That's what and maybe I misspoke, but it's really the frontline people who are making day-to-day decisions. And they do advise the upper levels, but in the case of a crisis, there should be probably more direction given from the upper levels to support those bottom-down decisions, or top-down decisions.
So John, I remember you from your October presentation. It was an excellent presentation, and I remember that the RT dot suffered PTSD.
That's correct. That's right.
And I know it's really difficult to delve into the details of communication from and among various levels, and I have experienced that effort to communicate quickly during a crisis from the frontline person all the way up to executive.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's a phone call at 9 o'clock at night, mm-hmm. and, oh, we forgot to tell you, this is what we did. Mm-hmm. I admire that you've made this recommendation. It's a start, and I have a question here. Under recommendation 5, there's wording, conflicting mandates should be identified and contained to provide objectivity and restore public confidence. I was just wondering, is that relating back to the communication up and down? Or is it just something different? I mean, they are related. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, particularly in that case. So, yes, there are conflicting mandates between Bureau and between the fisheries managers. And those were highlighted in the interviews that we gave, in which people had very different interpretations of what should have been done and what didn't work well during the drought. And, part of that is there's not a lot of trust among the wildlife people and the operators, the delivering folks. And we, in our previous iteration, we were emphasizing co-training, opportunities for dry runs where we look at scenario-based training where people work together to, mm-hmm. to solve, sort of computer modeled crises. And I still think that having that level of co-training so that wildlife managers are familiar with the issues that are facing water operators and vice versa, mm-hmm. I think that's very useful. But I also think that that in order to increase accountability, transparency, and public trust in the decisions that the agencies are making, it's important to have accountability, external accountability in terms of how we model, how we make our predictions, and how we make recommendations for water years. And so the regulated agency, the Bureau in this case, doesn't always act like a regulated agency. And it's a conflict for them to be producing models and estimates of water volume and making recommendations for releases when they're also in charge of, they have a conflict in terms of making those recommendations and managing the water resource. And so I think that there may be a place for there to be an external group, agency, or an external group that should come in and do the modeling, because there's such a level of distrust among both sides and among the public that I don't feel like we're getting the transparency that we need. And an independent evaluation of the resource on an annual basis, I think would be liberating for all the agencies, because then we would have a common basis for agreement or disagreement about the sort of social and management choices we make, not about the science. We don't have that right now. And the Bureau probably, while the State Water Board and the fisheries NIMPs are responsible as the regulating agencies to oversee the Bureau's assessment. My sense is that they have much more of a collaborative and a collaborative process in which they try to establish trust and move forward. And I think that that process needs to be more regulated and more constrained.
That's what this means, the contained part of this?
That's when
Okay.
I clarified the language in the more subsequent drought, this thing, or in the most subsequent draft, not drought.
Okay.
I clarified the language a little bit, but yes, that's where I'm going with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't want to hold you up from getting to slide number 1 or 2.
It's okay, we don't have to get to the slide.
I just want to.
Oh, yes, we do.
The chair, Randy, you mentioned sort of at the local level, operators do make those decisions, and I think it's important to understand that the operators at that level, they're striving to meet a downstream demand for water. And my experience in my career with operators is adaptive management is difficult for them to do. They don't prefer to do that. If there's sort of demand related issues, they like it laid out very clearly that they can do every day. So it's a challenge, and I could see, I kind of always had this image of a biologist in the control room, helping them operate the system. But that communication is really important because you're making these decisions that they're not used to making. They don't make biological decisions on delivering water, and it's so. I don't underestimate the difficulty and the importance of communication and how you do that, and whether everybody on the real-time committee is bought into the committee's solution is probably a question I would have that may be slowing down, communication.
They had a terrible job. It was really hard. They did a great job. I think everybody we talked to was amazing. And it is really, really difficult for the operators to make these decisions on the fly. And, they would do things like I think they did have a fisheries biologist looking over their shoulder a lot of the time, almost literally. But the biologists didn't understand some of the actions they took, like maintaining flow requirements in Wilkins Slough. They were like, well, why are you doing that? You should be holding water for the cold water pool for upstream, below Keswick. And the operators are like, well, our senior water rights holders have an allocation they can't get because river levels are too low. And so, kind of understanding in the different perspectives, I think would be useful for resolving those sorts of decisions. But in terms of the overall management of Shasta, there are some uncertainties that remain in terms of what happened and what happened in 2014 and how that resonated with the end of that year and with the next year that made everyone's job much worse. And that would have been resolved we had a bit of a system. There was a bit of a system malfunction in terms of how the cold water pool was measured, how the model worked, how the temperature sensor device worked, and therefore we overestimated the cold water pool. And we're releasing a lot of water. And that made decisions later on in the year extremely difficult. And in fact, unmanageable. There just wasn't enough water left to maintain temperature below.
John, you mentioned slide 1. We typically allocate about 20 minutes for presentation and then questions and answers.
Yeah.
We're 15 minutes into this, so
okay.
I'd like to encourage you.
My slides are only supporting documents. I don't have a slideshow per se. I wanted this to be a discussion, but since we've lunged forward to Sac River temperatures, let's look at a slide in particular. Oh, I do. Oh, okay. Let's go zip past that. Okay, if you can see this.
May I ask you a question?
Of course. Sorry, I can't hear.
Operations for power, for energy, how did they factor into your report and other aspects?
Yeah, I can't really address that. Can you, Amber?
I don't have a... no, I don't think we looked intensively at that specifically. There didn't seem to be a lot of conflict around that, and our interviewees didn't bring it up. The only thing I, just off of the top of my head, recall hearing about power was that due to the water conservation efforts in the urban urban metropolitan areas being very successful, there was actually a reduced use of power in the state, which I thought was really interesting because of all the energy it takes to pump water and move it to urban users. And if you reduce use by 25%, you're reducing your power consumption quite a bit. But we didn't look at, and there didn't seem to be a lot of conflict around power generation for the grid generally at reservoirs and outlets.
Yeah, the 2 points that I have to say to that are that the power generation grid is it's very reticulate. There are multiple levels, so if we're withholding water at one point, if we're withholding water at one dam, there are other dams farther up on the system, and each one is contributing, and so eventually we'll harvest that energy during release. Now, of course, overall, there was just less mechanical energy to harvest because we just didn't have the precipitation. But there were multiple, so we buffer that problem by having multiple dams with generators on them, if that makes sense. And the other thing, though, is that we have a ridiculously antiquated energy storage system. I mean, we should not be going into the future. We probably shouldn't be relying on reservoir for energy storage. It's not very reliable. And new technology is emerging that uses different means of energy storage. I mean, for example, one of the emerging technologies is to use energy to move a heavily loaded train car up a hill. And that, the mechanical energy of the water gets converted into the stored mechanical energy of this heavily weighted device up a slope. And so that's a sort of battery, essentially. And there is a bunch of research that's going into these sorts of alternative designs, but one of the problems with water management is addressing our energy need and our irrigation needs and our consumptive use needs, and that's one way to get around those conflicts. But that's an investment in the future, and we did not specifically look at this report, that problem. But going into the future, there are folks who are working at this, on this more over in the California Department of Energy.
Could I just ask a clarifying question on Susan's? You said power consumption or generation dropped? Are we talking about consumption in statewide? Or are we just talking about consumption of the water projects?
No, my understanding from the person that we were talking to is that it was because of reduced metropolitan use statewide.
Yeah, I mean, because power use related to water is only a very small, I think it's like 2% of that is related to importing water. Everything else is consumer use and industrial use of.
They didn't specify.
Yeah, I mean that's.
But we were moving a lot less water over up to San Luis, from the export pumps and over the Tehachapi.
I just want to make the point that if, in reducing power consumption statewide, that part is very small compared to consumer and industrial usages of the water, which was really the result of the reduction in end use of water.
Thank you. So I just want to direct you to this one slide that I do have here. So on the top, I guess you can't really see that. On the top plot there, you'll see that's temperatures at Keswick. And mind you, Keswick is a reservoir below Shasta Reservoir, and it's used to, it's like a forebay. It regulates flows down into the river. And so it's basically Shasta Reservoir water that's being held before release. And at release, you can see that so the blue line is 2014. And 56 degrees is what we call the thermal limit for the condition of winter run Chinook salmon. And you can see that, early in the year we were below temperature on that blue line there. And if you look at the plot below that, that's flows released from Keswick. And you can see that early in the year, these are the numbers, by the way, are days from April 1st. So by June, the flow releases from Keswick had increased pretty dramatically. May and June, they went up. And then they kind of flatlined for a while. And then they realized that they were losing temperature control, that there was some problem in the model. And so they started reducing flows by August. And at the same time, you can see, although they started reducing flows during that year, the temperature spiked up way above the limit. And this was the source of a huge amount of mortality in Chinook salmon. And we lost that cohort, most of that cohort. And then in 2015, there was a slightly different scenario. They just didn't have enough water. At that point, there was such low precipitation over that winter, and there was no holdover capacity. We had basically spent it. So there's very little holdover capacity because of the ongoing drought. Mind you, we had been in drought since 2012. And so, so in 2015, you can see the black line on the bottom, that's 2015, and it shows we kept flows lower than any of the preceding years. 2012 and 2014 are shown on that, and 2016 is also there, but don't pay attention to that for the moment. We had relatively reasonable releases. But you can see in 2012, the yellow line, we had a lot of releases. But in 2015, they really withheld as much water. They held quite a lot of water back. These are the lowest flows during that period. And yet, they continued to bump up against the thermal limits and exceeded on a number of occasions. And this was really a function of they just had a lot of warm water in the reservoir. They had lost the cold water pool. And there's a lot of uncertainties about how that happened, why the model wasn't really effective for measuring what happened in 2014. There were problems with the temperature control device, which regulates water. There were problems with the temperature sensor. There were problems with the thermal curtains in Whiskeytown Reservoir, which contributes flows to Keswick. And together, we made a huge error in terms of estimating that cold water pool, and it really set us back for at least 2014 and then 2015 possibly as well. What we really need, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, what we really need is sort of a post hoc analysis of what would have happened if we had not released so much water in 2014. Would it have affected 2015? What if that happens in the future? And what if we had had another year of drought? If we had another year of drought, that would have been the third year. So these salmon run in three-year clusters, right? They're three-year fish. And so if we'd lost that third cohort, that would have been pretty much it for the wild population. They would have been confined to a hatchery brood stock. Questions about that?
Dr. Duran, thank you. We've been, at the past few council meetings, we've been talking a lot about how we get from data collection, monitoring, to decision-making, and sort of what that trajectory looks like. It's a theme that's come up at the recent IEP workshop, and I think this is a really great example with charts and graphs and people involved in sort of how that data is helping inform decisions and how we're responding to it. In your report, you have a number of recommendations. Can you provide some sort of context on, of these recommendations that are in here, how much are really recommendations for improving science infrastructure, improving temperature gauges, improving monitoring protocols, and how much are related more to the human side of it, which is improving communication, improving decision-making structure, and really process overall?
Yeah, let me thanks for that question. That's really what I wanted to talk about today, and I haven't even got there. So let me just proceed with that sort of synthesis of our recommendations and the science that comes out of that, okay? Thanks. So we jumped ahead to Shasta a bit because, and Shasta really is, we included Shasta in our scope of work because of its intimate tie to the Delta and the tension between cold water pool resource management and water quality in the Delta. The part of me really wishes that we hadn't, because it's the most contentious part. You know, it's also the most emblematic. You know, it's the real symbolic representation of the conflicts between human use and environmental or ecological use. But so it's good we did it, but it's been a rough process to get to distill it into some kind of coherence. It's been very contentious. But let me take that cue and move on to some of the other recommendations, and then I'll talk about the science at the very end here. I don't know what our time is like. We're halfway through. Just burning time. So we talked about external accountability for Shasta operations. That's number one on my list here. I also mentioned the idea of a dry run, that is like interagency cooperation and training and dry runs using computer models to sort of do post hoc analyses and also project into future what folks would do. And that's part of a larger structure that we feel should be implemented to anticipate drought events. We don't really have Delta Drought Management Plan, and that should probably be nested within a larger plan for watershed management in general. But the Delta is such an important piece in this that it does merit its own plan. And part of this would be a structure so that agencies knew, who they were working with, who was responsible for what, when they were responsible, when the stages of when we would declare a drought, what we do with years like this. In February, it could have been a drought. In March, we don't know. Unfortunately, the operators have to make decisions about water allocations for end users in February, which really makes drought management decision difficult. But having a response structure so that we know when we're going to agree there's a drought, how we're going to get a leg up on it, and what relationships are going to be formed in advance. So, the RT-DOT was one structure, but let's know what that looks like before the next drought actually hits. The other recommendation we had is a funding plan. One of the problems that agencies had with managing this drought were just being able to ramp up enough personnel to go out and do everything. A huge amount of additional monitoring was needed, both to look at species, to look at water quality, to evaluate the barriers, to look at what was going up on the Sacramento River, and they didn't really have the resources ready to go, and they didn't have the hires ready to go either. So there wasn't really a great way. Like the governor's drought declaration really helped free up some money, and it helped the agencies wrap up more quickly, but it was almost late at that point. I wouldn't say too late, but it was late. And it made it, and agencies really struggled to hire qualified people who had enough skill and experience that they could deploy in the field to get the data they needed. So having a sort of secure funding plan in anticipation of a drought is really critical. And also having continuous, stable, secure funding for ongoing science in the Delta is also a really important theme. You'll hear that over and over again from us, but we do have gaps in the data that make it really difficult to interpret what's going on, because all too often we ramp up our monitoring because there's a drought going on, and this has happened since the 1980s. We ramp up monitoring, we deploy continuous water quality stations, we do additional monitoring, and then the drought passes and we come into a period of economic instability and we start pulling that stuff. So there are data gaps in what should be our continuous data are these really holes, and we don't know what to do with them, because to anticipate the drought, we have to really be rebuilding the system in the inter-drought periods. That's the time we need at least as many resources to be able to really fix the system before we get into another crisis. And so we don't have that right now. And given the value of the Delta, I do find it shocking that we don't have a sort of secure source of funding in place. Yes?
Yeah, Dr. Duran, can we get to, just to kind of build a foundation here, is what were the objectives? So if we're learning lessons from how we operated during the drought, and we were managing to certain objectives, were those in the biological opinions, or was the objectives in the permits conditions? Were we making objectives up based on what was happening? Maybe that would help to understand, you're monitoring certain information because that information is going to help you manage the system that meets some objectives. So what objectives were
so
they
like
trying
in the
to
case of
manage?
water quality in the Delta, we were really bumping up against in fact surpassed the mandate, for salinity. And so that required additional resources to be able to monitor what was going on, so that ag users knew what they were throwing on their crops, and so that the exporters and Contra Costa knew, what was going on and what to anticipate. Part of it is being able to monitor that salinity wedge. Salinity started moving in, right? And so monitoring that salinity wedge requires extra resources, and we had some of our continuous arrays had gone down. We needed more people, we needed more instruments. We should have the system really highly instrumented, and it should be maintained all the time. It's an expensive prospect, but it's probably cheaper than having to fix it post hoc.
So then in this case, what you're getting at is, that you're dealing with a rather inflexible or sluggish system to bring resources in.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if it's about the state having to bring in more state employees and you're responding to.
It's a very cumbersome process, right? You know, hiring new personnel takes a long time. Sharing personnel among agencies is very complicated. Sharing resources among agencies is often very sluggish just because of bureaucratic requirements. And so during a drought, it would be great to have a plan. Part of this is, you know, when we have a crisis, have a plan in place for sharing data, personnel, resources across various agencies. More interagency collaboration. And we could put that together with a Delta drought plan.
And everybody.
We would know what to expect.
And everyone agreed to the objectives that we were managing, whether it was the Chinook salmon, whether it was the salinity targets, you know, other. I mean, maybe a question is, you know, going back, it's the biological opinions that, and the state board's water quality control plan that sort of is the glue or is the goals that you're managing the drought, managing the system through the drought.
Yeah. So we're managing the system right now to D1641. We're managing the system to the biops. We're managing the system reactively instead of proactively. And that's my next point here on my list of things is to talk about.
Because I was going to ask you.
It's not on your list, but it's on my, yeah. So my next point on my list is an environmental water budget. The issue is that, well, let's just be blunt. Managing the system for listed species, this came up in the earlier discussion in the morning, hasn't been that effective, you know. The ESA, while vital, hasn't really provided a great directive for rebuilding stocks. You know, winter run are going down. Delta smelt, 15. They're going down. Longfin are not far behind. Fall run, we can't meet our doubling goals. We haven't been able to meet them for a decade. More. Other native fishes are going to be next in line. And you know, as they get listed, we provide protections, but it's very structured, rigid approach to managing a system. And we also have to manage other elements of the system for other stakeholders. And right now, we manage reactively so that standards are met, but those don't, they keep us out of, or they keep us barely out of jeopardy in terms of those species losses, but they don't do anything to rebuild stocks. We're not there, and the approach that we've taken is probably not completely effective. It's a baby step, but I think we really need to look at ecosystem-based management. Full disclosure, I worked with Jeff Mount on that blog that you brought up, Mr. Thompson, the one that you referred to. But there's broad agreement. That was a high-powered group of people. They were thoughtful folks, and they didn't have a stake in this. But ecosystem-based management would provide a little more flexibility. And as part of that, I do believe that having an environmental water budget and making a distinction, part of making an environmental water budget, and that's just a euphemism for water right, is figuring out the difference between ecosystem water and system water. The system water, and this is from a PPIC report that was done last year, is very good, I recommend it. Greg Gartrell, I think, was the lead on this, and Jeff Mount. So system water is what we need to make the Delta function as a transit for users. I'm running out of time. Okay, but this is important.
Yeah.
Okay. So ecosystem water is or system water is what we use to keep the Delta functioning as part of our water infrastructure. And ecosystem water is the water that we should be using to support our listed species of fish. And they're not the same. Keeping water quality high, that is salinity low in the Delta, is great for export and for ag users, but it's not necessarily providing a benefit for native fishes. Outflow might provide a benefit for Delta smelt and longfin smelt. They have lots of those fish are facing lots of problems, but outflow is certainly one of the mechanisms that helps support those species, although not exclusively. But those are two different functions. Outflow is ecosystem water. Delta water quality is system water. Separating those, I think, would advance us greatly in the discussion. And then having a defined allocation for the environment, or for, everything's the environment, for the ecosystem, that is for species of concern and for ecosystem function, having a defined chunk of water for that with a group of a council or led by an individual who are responsible for success. That is accountability. We talk over and over again about accountability, not just for the Bureau, not just for DWR, but also for ecosystem management. We don't have a whole lot of accountability in terms of our species performance. An ecosystem water budget would give us that.
John, you're obviously very enthusiastic and passionate about this subject.
It's a problem.
We have the executive summary that does a really good job of listing the key lessons and the recommendations. They're very clearly put, very easy to understand. We've had some clarifying questions asked. I now have a request for public comment.
Okay.
Melinda Terry would like to address the council on this file item.
Oh, I'm on now. Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to wear my North Delta Water Agency hat for this item number and my Central Valley Flood Control Association for item 10.
Do you really have hats?
Yes, yeah. Well, I should start wearing them just to have a little bit of fun, yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's my invisible hat. First of all, I really just want to commend the council for continuing to have the drought discussion, and maybe you started it back in January and February when we were scared that we were just going to go right back into a drought year. But when I went back, my office has documents going back all the way to 1927, so when we were hitting 2015 and 16, it was so bad. I started pulling out the late 70s stuff, and everyone gets all, we're going to do all these plans, and then the minute the drought's over, and we usually have floods like we did in 2017, we go to the next emergency and we kind of forget. So I do commend you. I hope you really stick with it. I think it's worth moving forward. I think based on the summary I read, there's really just a lot of good observations that appear to be made and recommendations based on reading the summary. A couple that I'll comment on that I think apply to both, the floods and the drought emergencies are the training of people and retirements. We definitely are experiencing that both at the local level at our RDs and then the state and federal agencies when we had the flood events. A lot of them have not seen these levee slips before, and it's new to them, and that training, and I don't know if you were, but a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4, Contra Costa County grand jury did a report about flood and looking at their local agencies, but one of the recommendations was we need to have some training of people, and so I think for the droughts, that's a good thing to think about. The other is the evaluation of the effectiveness of the drought barrier, at least where it was placed, and getting ready for those things, evaluating how that one worked, and/or other areas that might be good to have that done in advance. I know our agency had to spend a lot of money negotiating because there were 2 other barriers they were considering North Delta, and it'd be nice to have that kind of done ahead of time rather than when we're really facing an emergency. The really big one, though, that I found interesting that you brought up was the continuity thing. And with the prior lead scientist, I think I had raised it, and one of the science members, is the department used to be the lead agency, I believe, on an annual report that was done on the Delta. So if you go into the archives of DWR, these documents still exist. And they started them in the 1920s. So pre-computers, and essentially they took information from the different agencies that are involved in the Delta, and then they compiled it into a report. And there was only 1 year during World War II that they did not produce this report. All through the Depression and everything, they produced this. They stopped somewhere in the 1960s for a reason I'm unaware of. But one of the great things about it that gets you to that continuity you were talking about is, so each year you collect data, you get, and I think it'll help the council in your Delta plan, is then you get to compare, well, they would make recommendations on maybe what their short-term goal was. Let's say you're fishing game, or state fish and wildlife. And they might tell you what that is, but the next year it didn't get done. And in the report, they would capture what was the reason. Was it because the state legislature didn't appropriate funding for it? Was because a drought emergency came up and, your staff got sidelined? And those sort of things, I think, when you looked at those reports year to year, really helped the tracking, and I think will help you in your implementation of your plan. And so I encourage people to go back and look at those, because I just think about being put together before there were computers and how impressive. And here we are in a day and age with, emails and computers, and hopefully it would be easier for staff and a welcome thing. The other things, I obviously have not read the full report, so finally I would just say the things I hope will really be in there is really highlighting the fact that the voluntary agreement that was done in South and Central Delta Water Agency, I saw the terms fallowing and things, but it'd be nice to really describe that in a little bit of detail, because that was voluntary. Obviously, the North Delta Water contract, we have a drought provision, so we have a drought plan, if you will, but what's interesting, for the first time ever, it got triggered in 2015. And so some of those things that are mentioned were done and negotiated between the landowner, directly with the landowner and DWR. But the one thing I hope will really be mentioned as well is the effects that the TUCPs had on the Delta, because essentially the Water Board was relaxing the D1641 standards. And they do have drought provisions, and yet they were letting those, so those criteria that have been placed to protect the Delta were violated, if you will, allowed to be violated. And that, again, just from a tracking, I think really helps you, because in reality, when I looked back at every flood we have one every 10 years. And it was the same with the droughts, and they were almost next to each other like they were this last time. And so they do seem to be very consistent on a 10-year basis. So thank you.
Melinda,
Good work.
thank you. Any other public comment requests? Any questions of the council? Ken?
We talked about the blogs, have been mentioned a few times. I had thought we were going to address that a little bit, because there's some pretty important things in there, and a well-articulated vision that keeps getting into things that
Come back on April 16th. We're going to take it up at
Okay.
the DPIC meeting from 1 to 4. Great. John, Amber, Yumi, thank you so much for your time, all the work that you've put into this very important report, and we'll look forward to seeing how some of the recommendations become implemented. Thank you. All right, that completes file item number 9. We're on now to file item number 10.
Thank you. I'd like to invite up the panel to discuss the Delta Levy Investment Strategy Working Group. And Ryan, maybe you can introduce the panel members.
Good morning and welcome.
It is still good morning, isn't it? Yes.
It is still morning. So Ryan and I are going to split the introduction for this informational item. Good morning. I'm glad it's still morning. We are here to provide you with an update on the implementation of the Delta Levy Strategy Memorandum of Understanding with DWR and the Flood Board. I'm going to start by providing a brief bit of background, and then I will give it over to Ryan to explain the progress that we have made to date. As the council may recall, we began working on the Delta Levy investment strategy in June of 2014. Over the following 3 years, through extensive public outreach, we developed the proposed amendments to Chapter 7 of the Delta Plan that was approved at the council's March 2017 meeting. In addition to the public outreach, the council collaborated with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and the Department of Water Resources on the future implementation of the draft investment strategy. That collaboration led to the agency's development of a memorandum of understanding that was approved by the council at the June 2017 council meeting and was signed by all agencies in September. Since November, key agency staff have been meeting to develop a potential work plan for implementing their near-term priorities of that MOU. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. As Aaron mentioned, the initial task of implementing the MOU was to move forward on 3 near-term priorities that were identified by the signatory leadership of the MOU. And I'll talk a little bit about each one this morning. The first charge to the work group was to consider potential ways in which the prioritization developed in the draft investment strategy could be applied to the department's approach to funding Delta levee improvements. One approach that the department will discuss in a bit more detail would assign a certain amount of points to each funding proposal dependent upon where the location of the projects ranks in the investment strategy's 3 tiers of very high, high, and other. The work group's second priority has been to develop on a conceptual level how state investments made in Delta levees could ultimately be tracked and reported, with an emphasis on improving transparency and communication. Once again, as the department will discuss, the concept developed by the group to date would provide the department with the opportunity to regularly communicate its funding decisions to other state entities like the council, as well as interested stakeholders. This is intended to strengthen the overall general understanding of the decision-making process and further illustrate the state's return on investment on its Delta levee expenditures. And then the third near-term priority for the work group has centered on developing an approach for implementing the ability to pay concept for the Delta levee subventions program required in current law. As the department will discuss, while the work required to develop and implement a functional methodology will be ongoing, the work group has made substantive strides in recent months and plans to continue working diligently on the issue moving forward. And just to clarify, members, on the third priority on the subventions recommendation related to the draft investment strategy, there are 3 elements to that recommendation as it currently stands. The first 2 of which relate to the cost share, maximum cost share, as well as the increasing the $1,000 per mile deductible. Those both require, they are set in statute currently and require a statutory change in order for implementation to move forward or for any revisions to happen. The third element, the ability to pay, is something currently required in law and something that, as I said, the department will speak to a little bit more here shortly. And then finally, going forward, the work group plans to pursue long-range planning efforts on Delta flood management, on the Delta flood management front, and continue to strengthen the collaboration between the MOU partners. And with that, I'd like to introduce the 2 individuals now to my left. Mike Mirzwa currently serves as the Department of Water Resources lead flood management planner and has been the department's point person for the work group. And to Mike's left is Robert Charney, who serves as a senior engineer in the department's Delta levees program and will be speaking in more detail on the status of the ability to pay work. Michael, turn it over to you.
Mike, Robert, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Chairman, members of the council. I'll try and keep this pretty quick here so that we have an opportunity for some questions from you. As Ryan had indicated, today we're going to cover the 4 topics: the Delta levee investment strategy prioritization, how we're incorporating that into some of the department's investment priorities, reporting and tracking what we're proposing to go through and look at in the future to increase the transparency of the state's Delta levee investments, as well as the work that we've done to date at the department to better understand the ability to pay of the local entities that cost share into our Delta levee investments. And then we'll conclude with the the longer term work group activities. So a little bit of context here. Our priority as a working team since November has really been focused in on the Delta Special Projects Program because we are hoping to release a public draft project solicitation package out sometime in April or May out there where we can incorporate the Delta Levy investment strategy prioritization within our scoring criteria so that we'll be able to ensure consistency between the Delta plan and the next round of funding between the department. The Delta Specialist Projects Program, just a background out there, was established in 1988 by Senate Bill 34. The original focus of that act was really to make investments in levees to both protect the Delta Islands as well as protect the state's water supply. That was amended in 1996 with the passage of Assembly Bill 360, in which we also recognize as a community that there is an opportunity out there to actually get habitat enhancement by actually incorporating ecosystem features within our levee designs out there. The program has operated as a state cost share program where we're going through a competitive grant process by which we reward the projects that come to us as a state through the state cost share out there. So we really use a carrot approach in our investments. Since 2007, where we've had the major investments associated with Proposition 1E and 84, we have gone through approximately 8 rounds of revisions through grant programs. With each round, we go back to these PSPs and the scoring criteria to further encourage what I consider the good behavior to get to ideally these multi-benefit levies. What you're looking at here on this slide are the 5 categories that we used in the 2016 PSP. The first one is really financing considerations. The next 4 criteria getting into general considerations, export water quality, supply reliability, ecosystem enhancement, and levee system integrity. We break down points off of specific criteria that we're looking for within those projects that are submitted to the state. And what we're really proposing doing, which you'll see here in the next slide, and this is what the work group's been discussing, is adding a new table into the PSP where we will directly also incorporate the Delta Levy investment strategy funding priorities within the PSP to ensure that we're actually getting to those higher priorities. Now in the previous slide and this slide, you'll see where I have listed XX points. The work group still needs to come up with what that point total is out there. So we're looking, is it a percentage of the total points for this category? Is it a fixed amount? But the general thought is where you're looking the sub-bullets there. The funding priorities would be the maximum points if it were 100 points for the Delta Levy investment prioritization, that then we would then have, if you were in the very high category, you'd get the maximum. If you were one of the islands that was identified from the Delta Levy investment strategy prioritization as a high category, you'd maybe get half of that total. And then we would initially give 0 applicants for projects that are proposed that aren't in the very high or high priorities. However, consistent with the Delta Levy investment strategy, applicants would then have the ability to go through and ask for higher point considerations based off of why they feel that their project should be in the interest of the state to invest in, so you can get back up there. And that's what the lower bullet point is. And to implement that, we're asking that the Delta Stewardship Council be part of the team that the department has to review those applications as we go forward. So you would have the expertise as to what was the logic behind the levy investment strategy prioritization, and we would incorporate that into the review of those appeals and decision-making process. Consistency is an important element out here as the team has been going through and looking at the Delta Levy investment strategy and the 2016 project solicitation package scoring consistencies. You're looking at a table here that has metrics that have been proposed within your Delta Levy investment strategy, and they're small, but it's people, property infrastructure, water supply reliability, ecosystem, and Delta as a place. And there are specific metrics that you've talked about over time tracking to. And what we've gone through as a group and done is looked at the 2016 PSP and shown that there is consistency within even the old PSP, where the things that we were actually encouraging within the projects are within those 4 of the 5 categories. The last category is where we get into third-party financing. Is there actual financial readiness for these local entities to cost share with the state, the quality of the proposal as a whole. Does it look like it's a good project that's being proposed to the state? And one feature that was absent in the metrics, but something that the work group would work on, and I think is also consistent with the Delta Plan's ecosystem amendments, is also recognizing the important place that Delta levies place on waterside habitat as well. And right now, the metric is focused on the landside habitat and the levee that protects it. But in the past, The department has also rewarded projects off of their waterside habitat, and that's something we're committed to working on. Moving on to the second topic, reporting tracking, this will be a little bit quicker here, is the group has talked about actually having frequent reports to provide transparency in a number of categories. The first major block is the funding considerations, talking about the appropriations, the funds that are available to the state through our levy investment programs, the current appropriations, so how much of that total authority do we have right now to move on. This is really a measure of like the cash on hand. And then the last of those bullets is talking about the expenditures and commitments to date, demonstrating back to the public that we're moving in an expedient manner to get that funding out there. The investment need bullet out there is also talking about what it is we need to invest in dollar amounts. So when we start looking to the long-term longevity of these programs, we can then have conversations back with the administration on how many tens of millions of dollars are we going to need in the next 5 to 10 years. The last of the major items out there is getting into really refining possible outcome tracking and metrics. So it's coming up with dashboards and ways to, very similar to your by the numbers report, show the success of the actual projects in the Delta in ways the public can understand. And then the last two bullets there is we would report out on when there's the next round of PSPs or other grant opportunities, and when there are public venues for informal or decisional conversations related to the Delta programs. In our work group activities, we've mostly focused in on one of the 6 major programs the department has where we invest in Delta levies. And I just wanted to briefly let you know that the work group also plans on talking about these other program activities. The department has cost share programs where we make system-wide improvements, such as the improvements we're making in Yellow Bypass or Paradise Cut. We have the urban improvements that typically sit within the Division of Flood Management at the department, such as our West Sacramento and Sacramento levee improvements. Small community improvements, which came out of Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, are just beginning to start in feasibility studies, but this is where we would protect some Delta communities such as Isleton, Thornton, Rio Vista, Walnut Grove. All of those would be included in there, and they have submitted applications through the counties to the state to begin working on plans. Our ecosystem restoration projects, such as Dutch Slough, Grizzly Slough, Prospect Island, and there are many other Delta lands that we're looking at to doing ecosystem restoration activities. The Delta Levee System Integrity Program, which has 2 parts, the special projects, which I talked about, and the Delta Subventions Program, which is where we maintain all of the investments that the state has made. And then finally, I believe the council has had briefings in the past from the department on our Delta Flood Emergency Response Program and preparedness activities. But these are all things that we would report on a not just an annual basis, but as there's major milestones in any of these activities. An example of what the first category, getting into the funding considerations, this is a snapshot of a publication that the Public Policy Institute of California put out there, where they looked at Proposition 1 spending to date, and they had little bubbles showing how much money was actually authorized, how much has been appropriated to the state, meaning the cash in hand, and how much of that money has actually been expended. This would be one of the dashboards the team could work on to provide transparency in the Delta Levies program. And we would develop similar dashboards for the metrics as well as the venues. So moving on to the next topic, Robert Charney will get into detail about ability to pay. This is an effort that he's been leading within the department.
Chairman Fiorni, council members, thank you for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. I'm going to dive into ability to pay, do a deep dive. We're going to talk about the Delta Levee System Integrity Program's historic use of ability to pay, where we are today and where we're going. So I have a lot to cover and little time, so hopefully Randy won't kick me out before it's too late. But we'll see. So jumping back to 1973, the subventions program was created by the legislature. It's important to note that at that time, ability to pay was not included as part of the language, the water code language for subventions. It's also interesting to note that at that time, subventions cost share was a fixed 50% after deductible. Moving on to 1988, as Mike mentioned, the Special Projects Program was created. Subventions cost share was modified, was increased to a fixed 75%. Ability to pay, again, does not appear in the water code at that time. But when special projects was created, it was created without a specified cost share in the water code. The cost share was left to DWR. Basically, the statement was that DWR should seek reimbursement from beneficiaries of the program. Special projects apply to the 8 Western Islands. So DWR needs now to propose a cost share and defend it in order to move forward with this program, and that's what they did. And they did it, or DWR, we did it. Forgive me, I wasn't there at the time. But what we did is we proposed and carried out ability to pay studies on the 8 Western Islands that were eligible for special projects. 6 of them actually chose to participate at the time. Later on, all 8 became participants in the program and had ability to pay studies. Moving on to 1996, again, the legislature stepped in and made changes, and from a fixed 75%, subventions went to a maximum 75%, and the legislature asked DWR, through the water code, to apply ability to pay to subventions. They also incorporated a sunset provision into this language such that the 75% max would sunset and ability to pay would sunset also with the 75%. The two are linked together in the same water code. Moving forward to 2004 to 2008, DWR looked back, if you will, at what had been done, realizing that we now needed to have ability to pay for both subventions and special projects, or let me say that a little differently. Looked back at all the studies that were done and realized that although they were valid, they were done by different consultants and done with different methodologies, so they weren't consistent. And we wanted a consistent ability to pay methodology moving forward that could apply to both programs. And a team was assembled internally, a team of DWR economists, consultant economists, federal economists, engineers, and management staff from the Delta Levees program were on this team to review the previous studies and to propose new methodologies. And 2 methodologies were proposed. Additional test studies were conducted in the Delta. These methodologies were shared with the public, shared via the DELHAC meetings, and the result of these 2 studies and our sharing was a opposition by local agencies. They did not like these methodologies. And we received at that time what I like to call the infamous Downey Brand letter, basically a letter from the Downey Brand LLP lawyers saying these are all the things that are inappropriate and incorrect about these methodologies. They included things like underground regulations. DWR is proposing underground regulations. They said we were outside our authority and attempting to do illegal, attempting to extend our authority beyond the water code, and a number of other things. So needless to say, that set us back a bit. So let me share with you a little bit about that time frame. 2007, 2008 is when the housing bubble burst in the economy. And our team of economists are looking at this situation, looking back saying, well, again, let me back up just a little bit. They characterize the previous studies as follows. Agricultural islands do not have an ability to pay the 75% cost share. In fact, the state cost share should probably be 90% or more. They characterize urban and residential islands as that they may have an ability to pay 75%. They may have an ability to pay more. But in this economy, we could do all the studies we want. We're unlikely to demonstrate a higher ability to pay for those islands. Simultaneously, in those years, the subventions budget was cut, so they weren't getting the maximum cost share. Recall the sunsets, ability to pay, even though the sunset got kicked down the road several times, DWR was facing a sunset at that point and looked at it and said, you know, why should we invest a whole lot more? We've got all this opposition, we've got an economic situation and an opinion that we won't get a new methodology. We're not going to take further action. We're going to accept that those previous studies were appropriate and reasonable, and they inform our current policy and our current cost shares, and we're going to move forward with those. So now the ball rolls forward again. In 2013, there was a brief look at ability to pay, but importantly, in 2016, the DWR was again asked to demonstrate what our approach was with ability to pay. And something I failed to mention is that group of economists did say back in 2007 and 2008, if the economy recovers, ability to pay should be relooked at. So that That's in 2016, when inquiries came into the department, we realized we're not in the same economic situation. We do need to look at it again, and efforts were started. And one of the first efforts, of course, this is when I drew the short straw and came in on ability to pay. I didn't realize it was a short straw at the time, but it's very short. But at the time, we realized that the Delta Protection Commission had a contract with M Cubed. We were supporting with respect to the feasibility study, and M Cubed was one of the consultants that had been involved in ability to pay in 2007-8. So we change ordered in essentially a task order asking them to come up with an ability to pay methodology that would be consistent and we could go forward with. And my role was to review that. Looking at their work, realized that many of the issues that arose in 2007, 2008 were still present in the methodology proposed by M Cubed, and I didn't think that we were moving the ball forward. There were other issues that I didn't care for, so we kicked it around in-house and realized that we probably had what we needed to develop our own methodology internally, and we now call it sort of the DWR internal methodology, and that's what I'm going to talk to you more about now, if there aren't any questions. So let's start at the beginning. No, poor Randy. The water code, we have to start from the water code because this is what drives us. This is what allows us to move forward. I'm not going to share the whole water code with you. I'm just going to share the very relevant point that the department shall require local agencies to provide information and shall use that information to determine a maximum allowable reimbursement. That's what comes out of the water code. That's what allows us to move forward. This applies to subventions. Our ability to pay methodology relies on three very high-level concepts that I must discuss with you. First of all, we take a definition of ability to pay that actually came from that 2007, 2008 work. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it right there, but this definition still holds today. It still seems valid, and it informs and drives our methodology. Secondly, we're taking a new approach now that wasn't taken in 2007, 2008, and that is the state looks at the relationship between local agencies and their constituents as the local agencies issue. Previous methodologies that were proposed were they attempted to compel local agencies to raise assessments higher than they already had, to assess what their assessments were, evaluate whether they were good enough, and to attempt to get the agencies to raise those assessments. Many of the issues that arose in the Downey Brand letter were directed at this, or directed at that premise. So we've walked away from that premise and we've said it's the state's business to evaluate their current revenue sources, and what is their ability to pay for levies within their current revenue. And if they need to raise assessments, they'll have to work that out with their constituents. Not everybody agrees with this approach, but it is important for this methodology. That's how this methodology works. The third high-level assertion, and we call it an assertion because this methodology fails if this assertion fails. And it's a staff-level assertion because our legal is aware of it and thinking about it, and our executive team is aware of it and thinking about it. Our methodology will fail if the assertion fails. No one has raised any significant issues on it yet, but it is not yet adopted by DWR, but it would have to be moving forward. The state is entitled to reduce its cost share proportionally for levy work when a local agency spends tax and assessment dollars for work that is a lower priority than levies. And the first question that usually I'm asked when I discuss this assertion is, well, who's making the decision on a lower priority? That's a subjective decision. And I agree, it is a subjective decision, but we are required to make it by the water code. We're not relieved of making that decision. And the way an agency makes a decision is it writes itself guidelines, it writes itself regulations such that the decision factors that go into that decision are transparent and available for all to look at. So moving forward, we're going to be looking at either guidelines or regulations to inform us, to teach us how to make those decisions appropriately. I'm jumping to the things to do list. On that very first bullet, We need to develop a strong methodology. We've done that. What I don't have today is time to share the entire methodology, the entire mechanics. It takes me about 45 minutes to do that presentation. Our hope is to have a public workshop. It's not scheduled yet, but in the future, we hope to have a public workshop so that we can explain it more thoroughly. What that graphic is to give you a flavor of the methodology. It basically involves a deep dive into the finances of every local agency in the Delta. We look at the money that they raise, and we look at their expenses in the 4 categories you see on the screen. We don't have all the information we need today to calculate ability to pay, but that's the information that we'll be collecting. The second bullet, we're seeking expert opinion. We've been doing that internally for some time. This meeting today is also part of that. We're seeking stakeholder input. We are collecting more data from the agencies, the local agencies, via our recent request for subventions applications. The subventions guidelines allow us to ask for financial information that we haven't historically collected. We have instructed the agencies to provide us the financial information that we're allowed to collect, and that they must provide it in order to complete their application and stay in the subventions program. I've already mentioned it, but I'll mention it again because it's a key point, is we have to develop guidelines. We are likely to have to go through OAL rulemaking. That gets right at that underground regulation comment. You know, if we're going to be collecting information and we're going to be influencing how local agencies work, those are interpreted as regulations well, I'm not a lawyer, but that's what we hear. We will have to do more stakeholder and public outreach. Even implementation of this methodology requires a 2-step process, so we're looking at multiple years here to get this done. After I presented this to management and internally, I was immediately asked, well, is this really worth it? And certainly and I was asked essentially to do some benefit cost work on it, to do some cost work on it, and establish, you know, what are we going to get out of all of this effort? Because it's clearly a large effort. It's not trivial. It was a very difficult benefit cost ratio to establish, and that's because there's, basically the ratios I came up with were from 0.5, which represents a loss to the state, all the way up to 4, which represents considerable savings to the state. I also had to, I'll talk about why that's a wide range in a minute, but I had to essentially give my expected value or my best estimate for using my engineering judgment, and that came out at 1.2 with a net savings of $340,000 per year to the state. The reason that the ratio is so wide, it's not something I'm proud of, but the reason is that there's significant policy decisions that have to be made to implement this. Should the state implement a 50% minimum? There's one argument that that's what the legislature intended by falling when the sun sets, it falls back to 50%. But that's not also established, hard-coded, if you will, in the water code. So maybe the minimum is 0%. That changes your benefit quite substantially. The other question is, we can calculate a separate cost share for every single agency in the Delta. It's very hard to administer a separate cost share for every agency in the Delta. And do we revisit that every year? Do we revisit that every 5 years? How do we will need to allow local agencies to petition when they have a material change in their finances, because their finances establish their ability to pay. So all of these are policy decisions that have to come out of this process. As I mentioned to you, I also do not yet have a good handle on some of their costs. I don't know their drainage costs. We haven't historically collected that, and yet that's an important element of what they're spending money on. We don't know their administrative costs. So without those, I made guesses.
Robert, can I interrupt you?
Yes, that's true.
So what you're telling us is you have identified an approach, but it's not fully cooked yet.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
And the purpose of the work group that received the assignment of 3 matters was to work through these and bring back a recommendation to the council, DWR, and the flood board to implement the memorandum of understanding. So you've provided us a great history lesson. I've learned a lot about the ability to pay approach, but the bottom line is you're not ready to advocate how to apply a requirement that has been in place since 1996.
You're absolutely correct. We are continuing to work on this methodology to improve it, to tie these things down. And we're facing the fact that it sunsets in July. So how much investment do we actually make? What's prudent? What's appropriate? We can't anticipate what the legislature is going to do, whether it will be extended or not. So I'm trying to give you as much information as I can in terms of where we stand today and some of the questions we've asked, but it is absolutely not fully cooked.
Yeah, and the work group will continue to
Yes.
have a discussion about this?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Unless the council wants to hear more on this matter, I think you've done a really good job of explaining to us the complexities and the history and where we're at today that isn't quite far enough.
Okay.
Okay?
Mike was going to finish off this with a few last slides. I don't know if that's still your pleasure.
Sure, that's fine. This is a relief pitcher. Ninth inning. Bases are loaded.
I'm going to be real quick. One of the questions that's commonly asked of everybody is how successful has the program been going? This is one of the graphics that we've used to demonstrate from a fiscal standpoint and actually a performance standpoint how the Delta as a system has performed out there. The goal of this slide is the flatter the slope of the line shows you that the rate of frequency at which you're having failures has dropped. And what we're showing in this graph from the 1980s to present, that as we've had state investment in Delta levees, we have actually decreased the rate of failure of these islands. The green bar that you're seeing on the right-hand side shows the cumulative amount of money that the state has invested in the Delta levee through our Delta levees programs. There are other buckets of money that have been spent out there, but the bottom line message is we spent about $800 million collectively in the history of the program. Where you see the big jumps, that's where we've seen the bond funds come out there. So the program has not had stable funding. That is one of my concerns, and one of the things we'll continue to talk about through the work group. Getting into the longer-term work group activities, as I indicated earlier, we are not just going to focus in on the Delta System Integrity Program, but a key part of the Stewardship Council's Delta Levy Investment Strategy is also showing how the Delta as a system performs. So we're also interested in demonstrating and getting into the consistency with our system improvements, our urban improvements, our small community investments, the ecosystem restoration activities, as well as the residual management through our emergency response program. The group is going to, in the short term, revisit the Delta Levy Investment Strategy and the 2018 Delta Special Projects scoring criteria through that matrix. We have to come up with points. We're going to do that very soon. You'll get staff reports on where those points are, and we'll be doing that prior to having the public release out there. The next thing then is, over the next 3 years, we're going to be continuing to co-manage the Delta Levy Investment Strategy Decision Support Tool. Actually three important things there. That includes getting new information as the actual vulnerability of the levees is reduced through our improvements, talking about the exposure as that data changes, so it's getting the information into the tool. It's also about refinement of the tool itself and its usability for others, making sure that people are going out and looking at this as a source of information to help them in their decision making. And then the last area is where we get to prioritization of those investments that we've made in the past. We want to go back and look at the tool and the specific decisions that have been made through our programs to show how there has been alignment within there. We've started doing that work, but also allow that so when we come back and come up with an update to our very high and high categorizations, we can come back and look at what some of the projects were that came out there. The next two items is we're going to be developing an informational briefing schedule, so you'll be able to see when we're proposing coming to you talking about all of those programs. We'll also share not just what we're bringing to the Stewardship Council, but we're bringing to the Flood Board and the Water Commission, who also have authority over some of these investment programs. And the last activity out there is something that we will be getting the information coming in the next year, is the working group is going to review the Delta Reclamation District's 5-year plans. So this is where we're seeing what they're proposing doing in the next 5 years. I have asked the reclamation districts through the Delta Levee Habitat Advisory Committee to give us not just one projected future of what they're doing for their 5-year investments, but plan for if there's good weather versus bad weather, how those costs are distributed between improvements versus maintenance activities. So hopefully we can get some, let's call it, different bands or scenarios playing out within these investment plans, but we'll be using that to refine our tracking reporting and collectively come back with recommendations on not just the prioritizations, but actually what the investment needs are in the future in the Delta.
That's very encouraging.
That's all we had.
Okay. Questions, council members? No? We have requests for public comment. Melinda Terry, and then Gilbert Cozio.
Hello again, Melinda Terry, Executive Director of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. And in terms of what Mike had talked about and how they'll come back and report, I think that's a good way to do it, to at least get an annual report of what was done and how it played in, not only to DLIS, but hopefully to the statute. And I just want to remind everybody that the special project statute anyway, because I think it's been a while since they came out with a PSP for special projects, at least a few years, but the statute, section 12311, specifically mentions the 8 islands, but then it goes on to say that the program shall have as its primary purpose the protection of discrete and identifiable public benefits, including protection of public highways and roads, utility lines and conduits and other public facilities, and the protection of the urbanized areas, water quality, recreation, navigation, and fish and wildlife habitats, and other public benefits. So hopefully in the whole scoring of things, that is the statutes are really the primary guiding, so hopefully it's part of it. For the ability to pay, what I did here is, though, although it does sound like they have some kind of draft methodology and that they're going to have a public workshop in April and float that, I guess, and be able to have some public comment. So I guess I'm not an expert on how to do methodologies or anything, but at least I think it's a good thing to start a public process, get dialogue and input going, and I guess eventually end up with a guideline that is, went through the public process. My one concern that I'll raise just at this point was the slide that said it will take 4 full-time staff, full-time positions to manage. I'm assuming the ability to pay methodology is going to apply, I guess, to subventions and special projects. Is it both, or? Anyway, Department of Finance, the way they score salaries is for full-time positions, because your salary and benefits is usually $100,000. So if it's 4 full-time staff, $400,000, and we get limited funding, for these programs, it's just a big chunk out of there just to do that. So it seems kind of concerning from that standpoint.
May I answer that? It's our intention that the ability to pay will apply to both programs, but it depends on how the water code shakes out in the end, whether it can apply to both programs. If it sunsets, it may not be able to apply to subventions. We don't know that we're having a workshop in April. We will probably be appearing in front of the flood board in April to share similar information, but the workshop will likely be after that.
After that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Melinda, for that. And Gil, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Fiorini and members of the council. My name is Gilbert Cozio. I'm with MBK Engineers. We represent about 40% of the islands in the Delta, mostly in the Central and North Delta. We have a couple in the South Delta. And I just wanted to make a statement about ability to pay, just kind of give you some real numbers. Robert mentioned that they don't have all the costs that levy districts experience outside of levy costs, so I want to kind of give you some examples. First of all, there are 2 sides of the equation. One is how much can you generate from farm ground? And the second question is how much is left after you take out all these non-levy costs, and whatever's left is what we have to deal with. And that's why we're so concerned about losing that 75%, because even if it went down to 50, it sounds like you're only dropping 33%, but in reality our cost share is now 50 from 25, so it actually cuts in half the amount of work we can do. So let me give you some examples of what a levy district can raise, and then where some of these costs go. First of all, we're dealing with a couple of districts right now that's trying to establish an assessment rate. We've got one group of districts north of here in the Yellow Bypass area. They're actually not in the bypass, but next to the bypass. They're grouping together, becoming one levy district. We've met with them, talked to the farmers, talked to the landowners, and they estimate they can assess themselves about $40 an acre. That's kind of standard what we see in the Delta also. We're also working with another island in the North Delta that's working on a Prop 218 engineers report, and they're looking at raising their rate, which is currently $25 an acre, to 40 to 45. So that's kind of the general going rate, is the higher end as far as what these districts can come up with. I think what's critical is that the costs that they do spend on non-levy items is kind of a first priority. Robert mentioned that the Water Code does mention that DWR can ask us, to contribute more for spending money on lower priority items. However, to generate the money to come up with an assessment, you've got to farm, and most of these other costs are needed to farm. You got to drain the ground. Part of that is pumping water out, because these islands are below sea level. They get different rates of seepage coming in. You've got to clean out all those drain ditches, and it adds up to quite a high percentage of their assessment goes to those items. I'll just give you a few examples. I don't want to bore you with a lot of them, but we are putting a lot of these together for our applications to the subventions program that are due on April 2nd. So I'll give you an example. Track, which is in the Northeast Delta, has almost 5,000 acres. They assess the agricultural landowners $50 an acre, and they have a special assessment for a pipeline that adds a little bit of money, and so the net assessment is about $53 an acre. Their non-levy costs are $199,000. They can generate about $260,000 a year, and almost $200,000 goes to drainage mostly, and some other costs like their accountant and the requirements they have as far as legal and audits and that sort of thing.
Gil, which tract did you say? Tract?
BRAC. B-R-A-C-K. BRAC tract. It's along Woodbridge Road. It's at the western end of Woodbridge Road in San Joaquin County.
Okay. I was confused.
You've been there before. I've seen you on a video there, so.
Yeah. I'm just thinking. Oh, please proceed.
But that landowner doesn't own the whole island, so. Anyway, last year their PG&E bills, just to pump water out, just the electricity cost was $150,000. So they can generate $260,000 right off the top, $150 just to keep the ground dry enough to farm. When you add up all the other drainage type costs and accounting and that sort of thing, that's another almost $50,000. So what they've got left is about $60,000 to work on 11 miles of levee. Now the state plan of flood control is being updated. So the next update that comes out in 4.5 years, we'll talk about how much it costs to maintain these levees, not just operation and maintenance, but restoration, rehabilitation, rebuilding, and that sort of thing. And those numbers are in the order of $30,000 to $40,000 a mile. So an island like this really needs, I'd say, between $200,000 and $400,000 to maintain their levees, just maintain them. And these guys only have $60,000 to work with. So in the absence of 75% or something significant, they're not going to get a whole lot of their required work done just to keep these levees up. I'll run through a couple of other districts. King Island, which is a little further south in San Joaquin County, they assess their farmers $37.50 an acre. They do have some residential property, trailer court, and they have a couple of marinas which are commercial, so the total assessment is a net of about $52 an acre. So with their 3,200 acres, they can generate about $168,000 total assessment. Their non-levy costs are $115,000. And so it's about 2/3 of all the assessment goes to non-levy. And their power bills alone are about $15 an acre, or about 30% of their total cost. So what's left with them is about $40,000 or $50,000. So I can go on and on, but that's typically the magnitude of what you're looking at. The non-levy costs are huge, and they are required to farm, which generates the money to have an assessment. And so even though the Water Code does describe that DWR can help have us prioritize, this is number one priority right off the top.
So Gil, you would agree that let's just say there's an ag island deeply subsided, primary crop is corn or pasture, that their ability to pay is pretty low.
Yes.
Compared to an island that is urbanly populated with many capital improvements, perhaps vineyards, orchards, investment such as that, they would have likely a higher ability to pay.
Not necessarily, because you have to account for what those investments are. I know one landowner on Grand Island, which has a lot of vineyards going in these days, is investing $20,000 an acre just to plant the vineyard and the irrigation system that goes with it. So you have to account for all the years it's going to take to get back that investment, and so how much is left is kind of what they have to pay their assessment.
So it almost seems like it's switching to a willingness to pay as opposed to an ability to pay.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if I've invested $20,000 an acre to put in a vineyard and I've exhausted my funds to do that, then I want the state taxpayers to pay a higher level to protect the levies, to protect the investment that I've made.
Well, they're still going to pay their assessments. I mean, it had been in corn, and so they're going to pay at least that much. Yeah.
I guess my point is, to the degree that you have made capital improvements on an island, it would suggest that you should have a higher willingness to contribute to the safety of your island to protect the assets that you have invested. I mean, I fully understand the examples that you've given where the ability to generate income to support the ability to pay is limited in many of the islands in the Delta. But I think there is a way to show a difference from somebody that should be eligible for a 75% or higher percentage and somebody that probably is not eligible.
The only problem you're going to run into is that we can't raise more money because of Prop 218. And so specifically on Grand Island, their assessments are based on the elevation of the land. The higher your ground, the less benefit you get.
Well, but that often is tossed out, but we know from hearing from Steve Mello that on Tyler Island, they did successfully increase their assessments through in spite of the 218 obstacle.
Right.
Because they presented the requirements to maintain safety, and the landowners agreed, this makes sense.
Right, but they're only at 55, and if you remember last time Steve Mello was here, he said, that's it, we can't go any higher than $55 an acre. And that's about what these districts are paying now.
I think they're up to 60, and I think they included a cost of living index on their vote.
Yeah, most Prop 218 votes now do have a CPI link.
Yeah, yeah.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I think, you raised some really good points. I want to get to, Prop 218, and I'm not a lawyer. I've just been in that world for many years. I mean, it's a noticing, it's a protest process, it's a cost of service. I mean, you have specific improvements that you can relate to that have a cost. And so I don't think 218 is a limitation. It's something that any district or rate-setting entity has to go through, but it's not an obstacle to raising charges or rates. And I have to agree with you, Mr. Chair. This really sounds like, hey, we're assessing 37 or 40 bucks an acre, and we can only do so much with that. That doesn't get to ability to pay. That gets, like you're saying, to willingness to pay. We're locking in and saying that's all we can raise. So I think, this is a real difficult issue, and just the methodologies to try and get at this, but there's clearly, an obligation, fiduciary responsibility to kind of look at, there's a variation in ability to pay, but I really wouldn't want to use Prop 218 as an obstacle to raising money for needed capital improvements. It's not. Every, district and city that does water or wastewater works within those rules. So I would disagree respectfully that it's an obstacle.
No, I think you have to look at actually what runs the 218 election, and that's the number of votes. And the votes are dominated by the guys that don't have the high cash value crops, because there are so many more acres in corn and that sort of thing, they can't generate the money. And because they're lower, the way Prop 218 requires us to go by the benefit of that land, they pay a higher assessment because they have more benefit. They aren't flooded as deeply if a levee breaks. They require more drainage, so a lot of the drainage costs get attributed because of their elevation. And so if we did have an election, it's going to be dominated by the lower value crops as far as the majority.
Mr. Chair, to just follow up on Gil's comments about the types of crops, in our economic sustainability plan that we're updating at the Delta Protection Commission, I think we've identified about 10% of the lands in the Delta have grapes, the high value crops. So, what's being farmed is generally the corns and the low value, low revenues. So, it'd be great if everybody had grapes, and they could probably afford higher assessments.
Yeah, and
Not necessarily, but
well, in your
point well taken.
In the DLIS, it shows a simplified ability to pay, or shows the elevation of the land, and it assumes the higher the elevation, the higher cash value crop you can grow, and that's not a direct correlation either. Because some of the higher cash value crop areas that were identified in the DLIS are in the west side of the Yellow Bypass, which is all grazing land now because soil's terrible. I mean, you've got some orchards going in closer to Dixon and Davis, but down actually with, near the levees, they don't really grow anything except graze cattle.
Yeah. Well, Gil, thank you for entertaining us, our questions and our comments.
I'd rather say educating us.
Well, entertaining our questions. DWR has a responsibility to meet the law that has been in place for a long time, and they're working on it. We are pledged to help work on this. I would encourage you to enter in and help, because there's a solution to this problem. I'm not certain that we're close enough to call it good, but over the next couple of months, the work group is going to be engaging. You're going to present to the flood board. Presumably, there'll be some public meetings to vet this. The DELHAC will be involved. So lots of opportunities to help shape this into something that's usable.
Yeah, we'll provide whatever input is needed.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, thank you, as we will too, thank you. Okay, any other comments on this matter? Then, Ryan, anything you'd like to offer?
No, I appreciate the opportunity for the work group to update on our progress, and I think the progress that has been made to date, I think, shows the potential that the work group has in terms of moving forward on a number of other items. So look forward to coming back before you at the appropriate time and updating the council on the progress. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Mike, Robert, thanks so much for coming and for the work that you have been doing, engaging at this work group level. For a long time, didn't seem like there was much progress, but recently we've seen some progress, so we appreciate that. Aaron, thank you for your role, and that concludes file item number 10. Brings us to the end of the meeting. I would point out that we have an opportunity for public comment now on any matter, should the public wish. Okay. Then our next meeting will be in the Delta. It'll be at the Pyramid Building, the Ziggurat Building, where the Department of, no, it's near the river. It's a beautiful building. That's where the meeting will be on April 26th. So, meeting adjourned. See you then. Thanks.